Hi, everybody. Me again, the third day of our event. So today we have notable lectures, and they are going to talk about Ireland too. So it's a great pleasure and an honor to have Professor Dr. Laura Izarra, Professor Parias from Cork University, Lara, Rebecca, and Rosiline and Fernando, my researchers who are also going to take part of my team today. So welcome here, everybody, and still happy St. Patrick's Day. We are still celebrating. We haven't finished celebrating St. Patrick. St. Patrick's Day lasts longer, lasts a week. So let's listen to the first lecture. Professor Dr. Piaras McHenry is a member of the Department of Geography and the Institute for Social Science in the 21st century at the University College Cork. His primary interests are in migration and integration studies, and he has taught, researched, and published widely in this field for nearly 30 years. He was a founding member of Migrant and Refugee Rights Center, NASC, in 2000, and has also served in advisory capacity on a number of other statutory and NGO boards, including his present involvement with Cork City of Sanctuaries since 2018. Prior to that, he taught at Université d'Orléans, France, and served in the Department of Foreign Affairs with postings in Brussels, Beirut, and Paris. May I ask if information? Okay, this is about briefly what he has done so far. So I believe he tried his best to summarize, because I believe he has done more than what he has written here. So welcome, Professor, to our event, to St. Patrick's Day, our virtual event. Hope we can meet in the future in Dublin or in Cork or here in Bahia or in São Paulo. So I believe Laura is going to invite you in the future to come and join us for our next events. Welcome. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for your generosity of stay here with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Borges. Thank you, Noelia, for your welcome. And it's a real pleasure to be here virtually in Brazil today. It's a very strange St. Patrick's week for all of us. We are at home. I know you are at home as well. People are now gradually getting these vaccines, and we hope for better times. But in the meantime, if there is one advantage, it is that we can communicate across borders using these amazing technologies, and we're teaching in the same way. So that is, I suppose, a positive side. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, all right. Anyway, my topic today, so when you have the title there in front of you, it's called Uninventing Ireland, Migration and Identity in a Changing Nation. And those of you who are students of Irish literature will recognize the source of that particular quote because it's a very famous book by Professor Declan Kiberd, which is called Inventing Ireland, and which was published back in 1995. And what he tried to do in that book was to give a critical history of modern Irish literature, and in doing that, to address the fundamental question: how had the country, Ireland, invented itself as a complex modern place after centuries of colonization? This is not the place to rehearse the arguments of that book all over again, and I'm not a literary scholar, and much new scholarship has been done since that book was published, but I'm using it as a point of departure for the questions which I want to consider about the period which unfolded after the publication of that book. So I see it as marking a certain point in the development of this country and this nation. And my question really is, how have we changed and what kind of nation have we become since the time Khybert's book was published back in 1995? So almost a generation ago. Kybert himself made a significant contribution to developing a more complex scholarly view of Ireland's cultural traditions and therefore its collective identity and nationhood. I studied English myself in University College Dublin back in the early 1970s, at a time when the dominant scholarly perspective on literature in Ireland was actually a rather, how will I say, excessively male and excessively focused on the great writers of American and British literature. Of course, there were some Irish names as well. Although even back then, there were a few lecturers, and I remember Seamus Dean in particular, who did pay attention to the broader traditions of Irish writing itself. There was also the beginning of a recognition that Ireland, notwithstanding its conquest by Britain and the English language, had struck back in its own way in a great literature written sometimes from the edge and sometimes from the center in the language of the conqueror. Because English, of course, was not our first language. It was not the language of this country at the time. A peculiar feature in how that literature was appreciated at the time was the gap between the Irish and English languages in the university, in the academy, between two literatures and often two worldviews. And one of Declan Kybert's distinctive contributions when he began his own academic career later in the same decade was to insist on the interconnected nature of the two languages and the two traditions and the two literatures in Ireland. He had a degree himself both in English and in Irish, so he was well qualified to do so. And he challenged that dominant canonical tradition, the English literary tradition that I've mentioned, as well as what was sometimes the isolationist view of the Irish language academic community, which perhaps was rather defensive themselves about their identity. And after that, it was difficult to see the two as being separate because of Kybert's contribution in speaking of the two together and mentioning their interconnectedness. The reason I've chosen the early to mid 1990s and Kybert's book as my starting point is actually more complex than that as well. Ireland itself in that decade, the 1990s, entered into a series of seismic convulsions which, taken together, have ensured that the Ireland as we know and inhabit today has changed out of all recognition to the one that went before. I won't have time to go into all the details here, but I'll just mention a few of these changes. There were the radical societal changes of that time, especially the precipitous decline of church influence in social life after a series of scandals in the early 1990s, accelerating changes in the status of women in particular, the legalization of LGBT rights, the introduction of divorce, and most recently, the removal of the constitutional ban on abortion, and that only happened a few years ago. It also included this period, most pertinently for my purposes, the long boom in the Irish economy, which led to it being called the Celtic Tiger after the Asian Celtic Tiger countries like Japan and Korea. And many Irish who had actually emigrated themselves in the 1980s returned to this booming economy. In fact, about 500,000 people emigrated from Ireland in the 1980s. And remember, the total population of this island it's less than 7 million people. And about half of those people who had left came back. And then the other big change in 1998 was in the signing of the Belfast Agreement, which brought relative peace to this island for the first time in 30 years of trouble and conflict. And significantly as well, in the South, we amended the Irish Constitution so that we no longer claimed the whole territory of the island. And instead of that, we substituted the notion of identity and belonging as being primarily a matter of acts of will and consent rather than a legalistic approach. And that question of the loosening of how we think about identity is a key one I want to talk about today. These changes also prompt other questions about nation and identity, including the ways in which they are represented and how we see it from outside the country. And it seems a good kind of period to talk about this today because we're celebrating the feast of St. Patrick. And there was some kind of public commemoration of St. Patrick in at least 70 locations around the world yesterday, the 17th of March. There are also Irish Studies departments in every continent, including the one that I have the pleasure to be talking to today. Ireland is the only small country whose leader can be assured of an annual meeting with the President of the United States, even though it took place online yesterday because of the pandemic. And it raises the question, how did a small island with 0.1% of the world's population of nearly 8 billion nowadays, how did it come to play a role so far beyond its size? How has this influenced our view of ourselves? Is there any reason to believe this country might or even should continue to occupy such a disproportionate role in the future? And how might we define this nation today compared to the one we grew up in and which Kybert captures in his book? And I'll come back to that. How have we become more porous and more diverse in the contemporary period? And how is that reflected in what we think about our nationhood? I want to make 4 points to begin with, and then I will have a PowerPoint to show you some images of these changes. The first one is emigration itself. Irish emigration is not unique. We're looking at a European tradition of emigration going back for centuries, as you will know very well in Brazil, and starting with those transatlantic migrations to North and South America, and then the process of colonialism, imperialism, and conquest, which we saw especially in the 19th century, though earlier, as you will know in some cases. And the Irish were very much part of that, but we also had, since the famine onwards, and the famine was in the middle of the 19th century, really down to the present day, a long tradition of very strong outward emigration. And that's what gave us this diaspora. We only have 7 million people, but we have a diaspora, which some people suggest is closer to 80 million people. And we're not just present in the English-speaking world, but also, as you know better than I do, in Argentina. Not so many in Brazil, but we'll hear about Argentina shortly from Laura. And also now there are Irish people all over the European Union, in the Middle East and beyond. So we are a worldwide diaspora, and that becomes a kind of a self-confirming process as well. A second factor to mention here is the question of colonialism and the post-colonial turn. Many Irish people saw the struggle for independence as essentially a matter between Ireland and Britain, but a minority did make common cause with other oppressed peoples worldwide, and their awareness was that this struggle between Ireland and Britain was actually part of a wider one against colonialism, and this implied a new and wider context beyond the narrower earlier version of Irish history, where we saw it as a purely Anglo-Irish affair. And I suppose the point I would make there is that the timing of that anti-colonial struggle, especially in the European context, was significant because it was one of the first successful movements of that kind anywhere. Now, I'm pushing to one side the rather exceptional cases of those South American countries, which throughout the Spanish and the Portuguese in an earlier generation. My point is that in the more recent past, the Irish struggle against English colonialism was seen as a kind of a precursor and therefore very influential in countries as diverse as India and Algeria. In terms of historical sequence, though, Ireland's case can be seen as one which led and influenced other liberation movements. And in that sense, again, we were given a prominence in these global debates and actions and liberation movements, which was beyond the size of our own country. A third factor was the simple reality that Ireland had the good fortune, partly as a result of the Celtic revival here in literature, but also paradoxically because of its integration within a wider British and Anglophone world, to produce a number of great writers, notably in the early 20th century, who made a major contribution to modernist and world literature. Not coincidentally, a number of these were writers in exile. That gave Ireland and Irish writing and Irish identity a visibility far beyond the island itself. And then finally, I already talked about the question of language, including the enormous cultural loss entailed by the decline of Ireland's own indigenous language, the Irish language. Irish writers and Irish people generally enjoyed the advantages and the disadvantages of liminality, being seen as different and having a different tradition, while also benefiting from the fact that much of their work was produced in what became the most significant world language. And by contrast, for instance, Finnish or Hungarian or Vietnamese writers do not enjoy this advantage in the world's literary system. Excuse me. So summing up, the backdrop to the period I'm about to describe shortly is a complex one, and the self-image we had of ourselves and this kind of place in the world and so on, that did not really correspond with the reality of the Irish nation in Ireland itself. The country and its culture and its identity became known worldwide in a manner which was disproportionate to its size. But we have to set against that a tendency to an exceptionalist, self-regarding, inward-looking complacency in Ireland itself. The reality of post-independence Ireland, the part of the island which became independent, the 26 counties, was a highly repressive, church-dominated society where economic development was slow and people continued to leave in their vast numbers. It was a place of exclusion and silence about the continuing departure of the poor, the subsidiary position of women who left themselves in disproportionate numbers, and the savage treatment meted out to those who did not conform. Unmarried pregnant women, for instance, gay and lesbian people, travellers, nonconformists. Emigration in those cases drained away for decades much of what otherwise might have become an unstoppable force for change. Ireland remained resolutely monocultural, with an extremely small percentage of foreign-born residents, many of whom were themselves born to Irish parents. For Irish people of the time, that's my generation, the first encounter we had with the other, however you define that, was usually abroad and not in Ireland. Race and racism were out there, not something back here, or rather, that's what we thought. The reality was one of unquestioned assumptions that we made. So we had, for instance, the collection every Lent for what were called the Black Babies, and these were collections that happened in every schoolroom. But the Black Babies were out there in Africa, and they were presented as victims without agency, and we were the people who were going to somehow rescue them by these monies, these coins that we were putting in those boxes. We thought similarly about the thousands of Irish missionaries who were toiling in foreign countries. And if there were echoes of civil rights struggles from places like the United States, we didn't know much about them, nor did we know that our own role in American histories of race and discrimination was not a very noble or edifying one. Some of these contradictions did come to be challenged over time. Some of the questioning actually began as far back as the 1966 50th anniversary of the Easter Rising, which led to the Declaration of Independence, if you like, of our nation. And that was celebrated in 1966 with much pomp and a very simplistic and unquestioning and triumphalist public rhetoric. I remember it very well myself because it fell to me as a 12-year-old in my primary school to read the words of the 1916 proclamation of the Irish Republic to the masses of the parish. There were large crowds there. And I read them in Irish, although they had been written in English, because we inhabited a nation where aspiration and myth sometimes prevailed over reality. The noble aspirations in the proclamation, in fact, bore little resemblance to the everyday Irish nation of the time or to our inflated image of ourselves. This was a world of us or them, Irish versus British, dualism, uncomplicated and simplistic. The official mindset of victimhood was later mocked by historian Liam Kennedy from Belfast in what he called the Mope syndrome, the most oppressed people ever, ensuring that we had endured centuries of oppression and suffering that was like no one else had ever endured in their various histories. Post-colonialism notwithstanding, the early Free State, that is the early independent Irish state, had displayed little sense of solidarity with the oppressed citizens of empire, and there was an uncomfortable sense at times that this was not unconnected with issues of race and colour. There were even some who argued that the Irish deserved their independence because they were white. Meantime, the state itself was, as I mentioned already, a narrow and oppressive place with a dominant and frequently intolerant religious ethos, a rigid social conformism, and an entrenched conservative class determined to hold on to its grip on the national economy and political system. Ireland's economic well-being actually declined steadily from its pre-independence period, and the country remained mired in an outdated vision of itself, fetishizing the rural and the pre-modern, celebrating its unsullied culture, free, as we thought, of malign, pagan and foreign influences. Yet change was already underway, with membership of the EEC in 1973, a major investment in education, and the arrival of such novelties as foreign travel and what we used to call the continental package holiday for those who could afford them, bringing new experiences and perspectives. But as I said, Ireland itself, excuse me, remains largely ethnically homogenous at that time. There were very few exceptions to this general rule. And here I'm going to go to my slideshow if I can. And from now on, I can only see the slideshow, so I'll have to talk and hope that everyone can see what I'm discussing here. Well, first of all, I should have mentioned this as well, by the way. This is the picture of Irish as immigrants in the world. You can see we're at the very top of this particular chart, with 17.5% of the population born in Ireland living outside the country. And you can contrast that with your own Brazil, where the figure is 0.7%. So yes, the being diasporic is part of what we're known for, I suppose. And here again, we have a picture here of the global Irish diaspora with a presence in all parts of the world. So it does give us an understanding of the realities of migration. Here we have a report from 2017 about being an undocumented Irish person in the United States. So that ought to give us some sympathy with other migrants in other places and from other places. Not always the case, but it does illustrate that. So the period I'm talking about then, before the 1990s, there were very, very few people of mixed ethnicity or mixed race living in Ireland. A few of them did begin to emerge, and these two you see here. One is Paul McGrath, born to a Nigerian father and an Irish mother, and in his case, he became probably Ireland's most famous ever soccer player at a time when the Irish team in the early 90s was actually doing quite well internationally. We got as far as the World Cup for the first time. And McGrath became a kind of a heroic figure. And musician Phil Lynott is another example. He was the leader of a band called Thin Lizzy, which had quite a number of successes. And one of his parents was from British Guiana, nowadays called simply Guyana. So we had a few figures like that who stood out as iconic, but they were so few and far between that we can say in a sense that they were the exceptions that proves the rule. So if we come back to the question of Ireland until Kybert's time in 1995, the publication of that book, there was an ideology of a nation which was largely unquestioned and rather self-congratulatory and, as I say, very monocultural. And this is where I come back to a few points about Kybert's picture, so to speak. First of all, the underlying ideology of the nation itself. There have always been two strands in the Irish tradition of nationalism. One is what you might call the blood and soil tradition of nationalism, influenced by German Romanticism. I'm thinking particularly of people like the philosopher Herder. And the other nationalism is a more French tradition of political nationalism. The nation was political, and to belong to it was an act of will. So that was different from the more essentialist, if you like, blood and guts idea of the earlier type. And those two forms of nationalism have always been present in the Irish body politic. And in one way, that has pointed us the way forward, because the nation, if it's political, can be constructed as inclusive. You don't have to be born into it or to have a certain blood type in order to belong. The second point is that the secularization of Irish society, which really begins, as I say, in the 1990s, that has seen the identification of Catholicism as a central requirement of Irishness give way to something much looser, more porous, and a broader idea of what Irishness is, which is really based on cultural identity. So we're opening up a kind of a wider space there for people to feel they belong, rather than the narrower, older one that I've been describing. So, and to go back to Kybert then, I argue that his vision of the nation and the invention of Ireland, to take the title of his book, it was generous and inclusive in one sense, but nonetheless it was limited. And in his concluding paragraph at the very end of the book, he has a section in the book on Irish studies, in fact. His last paragraph is, if the notion of Ireland seemed to have become problematic, that was only because the seamless garment, once wrapped like a green flag around Kathleen Ní Houlihan — Kathleen Ní Houlihan is a kind of a figure for Ireland itself — had given way to a quilt of many patches and colours, all beautiful, all distinct, yet all connected too. No one element should subordinate or assimilate the others. Irish or English, rural or urban, Gaelic or Anglo, each had its part in the pattern. Now, the point about all that is that he is trying to reconcile what had been before then quite a bitter dispute, including an academic dispute about how one saw the past, how one saw history, how one saw the place of the revolutionaries of 1916 and all of that. And of course, that was in turn coloured by the Troubles, which began in the 1970s in Northern Ireland. But my point would be that while it's very fine, this vision he has of a kind of an inclusive quilt, which with many different parts in it, it still is a limited vision in one sense, because he really only uses that phrase Gaelic or Anglo, because still in 1990 or 1995, it was difficult to imagine an Ireland where the quilt might also contain many other patches and colours, reflecting the presence of peoples from other parts of the world with different backgrounds, culturally, ethnically, and so on. And yet, that's exactly what begins to unfold in that period after 1995 and after the book that I'm being referring to came out. And that's really what I want to look at. So what happened in the following 30 years, which changed Ireland as much as it did? And my argument is that it has been a seismic change in various respects. So even if we go back here, this is a lot of charts, I'm afraid, because I'm a social scientist, but I don't expect every detail to be retained by you. But this is a picture from the 1996 census. And what it shows very simply is that Ireland at the time was, first of all, a very homogenous country. There were very few foreigners living there. And as you can see there, the numbers that were there, in fact, were principally from Europe and from the United States. The largest single number there is the US, and there were still only 16,000 of them. And most of those would have been, in fact, of Irish background anyway. There might have been some people working in multinational companies and so on. Very few of them would have been Black or Asian or any other ethnic group. They would have been white and mostly, as I say, of Irish background. And what we get, though, in the following years, this is the Celtic tiger roaring in those years, which means that industry is investing in Ireland. There are new forms of employment being created. So there's an inflow, first of all, of Irish people who had left in previous decades. And you can see that in the chart here, where about half of all of those coming into Ireland in the 1990s were actually returning Irish migrants. But the other feature, which is quite new, is the beginning of people arriving from other parts of the world. First of all, from the UK, and by the way, they weren't all returning Irish. Some of them were British people coming to Ireland, reversing what had been a tendency for strong Irish immigration to Britain previously in the 20th century. Then people from other parts of the European Union. Again, the US is still present there, largely because of the investment and the industries which were coming at the time. And then the rest of the world. Now, that might seem like a very modest figure, 30,000. But remember that we're a small country. And that was a significant change even before the turn of the century. But what you got then in the following number of years is a whole series of new developments. This is work permits. You have to have a work permit in Ireland if you're from outside the European Union. And that figure there that you see from the kind of turn of the century, 2000 onwards, that's a huge growth in the number of foreigners from outside Europe or outside Western Europe working in Ireland. Some of them, in fact, are from Central Europe. They're from places like Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Hungary, places that later joined the European Union. But at this moment, they're still outside, and that reflects the increasing insatiable demand for labour in Ireland itself. And also the fact that with the investment in education in Ireland, Irish people themselves were better off, and they didn't necessarily want to do the work in, say, agriculture or horticulture or the more modestly paid kind of work any longer. They could aspire to other things. So there was a gap at that lower end of the market for migrants to come in, just as there was one at the very top end of the market for these new high-tech industries that were being created in Ireland. This another chart here, and again, this is the same period. We're looking at 2002, the changes in the composition of the population born outside the country. And what you see there across the board is a remarkable increase in people from other EU countries, people from the rest of Europe, that's, Eastern Europe and Central Europe, people from Africa, a lot of those are asylum seekers, people from Asia. One thinks, for instance, of the Philippines, which has a great tradition of exporting nurses around the world. People from the Americas, including South America, and that's where the Brazilians come in, and people from the Antipodes, that's Australia and New Zealand. Now, some of them would have been the Australian-born children, for instance, of Irish migrants returning back to Ireland. Our own daughter went the other direction. She lives in New Zealand nowadays with her Kiwi husband. And this gives another picture then, because that process I've just been describing actually accelerates after the 2000s. And here we have the picture between 2006 and 2016. Now, we did have a catastrophic economic crash, as indeed we had around the world in 2008. That's why there's a big drop in the middle of that chart. But what you're looking at there in terms of numbers, and again, I don't expect you to take in all those numbers, but you're looking at a huge increase in the foreign population of Ireland. And that's something which has really changed. That has been a game changer. And you can also see they come from a very wide variety of countries. So blue is the rest of the world. Purple is the first 12 member states of the European Union, the ones closest to us. The green are those from Central and Eastern Europe who joined more recently. And the British are still there, but in smaller numbers. If you look, for instance, after 2008, we had that crisis and you saw the numbers falling there. But then by 2015, they're going up again. And the biggest single element in the 2015 immigration to Ireland are people from other parts of the world. This is where African countries, Asian countries, and South American countries fit in. And this is something completely new, a complete change for the structure of the Irish population. Another way of putting it here is the 2016 census, which is our most recent census. And again, you've got the distribution of the population here by nationality. And you'll see these are the top nationalities living in Ireland, apart from the Irish themselves. And interestingly enough, the Brazilians actually come in there. And although it says 0.3%, that might sound like a tiny figure, but that's about 30,000 Brazilians in Ireland now, from a base where 30 or 35 years ago, we had virtually none. So the whole country has changed dramatically in the last few years. That's really the point I'm trying to make. Here's my own city of Cork, for instance, small city, population of 200,000. But what you have there, the darker colours are the areas of the greatest concentration of foreigners. And as in many cities around the world, you now have that concentration of migrants in the inner city areas, where in some parts of the inner city of Cork, you have up to nearly 50% of the local population being made up of people who were born somewhere else. I won't go into all the other details because I know the time is not on my side, but the other feature I just want to mention is the number of asylum seekers coming here. This gives the picture, for instance, at the end of the 20th century, when we had at one point 1,000 asylum seekers a month arriving in Ireland. Again, we had a booming economy, a relatively open system for dealing with them, although I'll come back to that. So you had a big increase in the numbers coming. And here we have again, this is asylum seekers between 2008 and 2019. And while there is a big drop after the crisis of 2008, the country becomes a very unattractive place, even if you're fleeing. We do have in recent times an increase again. So you have a whole series of different streams of migration into Ireland. This chart, for instance, shows the variety of asylum seekers coming from countries all over the world, from Zimbabwe to South Africa to Cameroon, Georgia, over there in beyond Southeastern Europe, various parts of Africa, Syria, of course, where we've had a lot of people coming as refugees. The Syrian civil war is now 10 years old this month. So that's kind of a background. It wasn't all perfect, by the way. Here's a picture, for instance, of a refugee camp, which actually dates from 1956. And that was the outbreak of the Hungarian revolt against the Soviets. And we took in 1,000 Hungarian refugees, and we treated them so badly that they all left again. They went to Canada. But this is the same place now, today. It's the same location exactly in the country. It's a place called Knockalishin, near Shannon Airport. And this is the modern version of that picture I just showed you a moment ago. These are overcrowded forms of accommodation where asylum seekers can be left for many, many months. Many years, in fact, before they get the right to remain, or in some cases may be deported. So how was all this treated? I need to stop at this moment and ask how much time have I got left, because I will have to make some cuts in my presentation. Or will I just keep going, Noelia? Right. If anyone wants to tell me anyway, they can send me a message. So the point I want to make is that in the middle of all this, we were not used to people of different backgrounds, people of different ethnicities. And I'm mentioning some of these people because they were among the first to kind of encounter this. We began to see, for instance, we have something here called the Rose of Tralee contest, which is a kind of a contest aimed really at the Irish diaspora, where, and it's a very old-fashioned idea now. It's based on old-fashioned ideas about the place of women in particular in society. But it's interesting that the first person from a mixed ethnic background to win that with her own background of being half Filipina, half Irish, was this woman here, Elizabeth Mendo Sullivan. She won in 1998. This was a first kind of for Ireland as well, a pop star called Samantha Mumba, who became a major figure here in 2001, half Irish, half Zambian. You may say, as Brazilians, what's the big deal? And I can see that in Brazil, which is an extraordinarily mixed society, it's not a big deal. It was a big deal for us, though, because we have never previously dealt with the questions of mixed ethnicity and the challenges posed. Now, I'll send this presentation on for anybody who wants it, so I won't dwell on this here. But these are some of the reactions which I've tracked online when some of these events occurred, where you get really explicitly racist reactions to any question of mixed ethnicity in Ireland. As it says here, you have to be pure white to be Irish. She is only a half-breed. I won't pronounce the word. The point being that underlying this kind of proud nation that we thought we were, there was actually quite an embedded notion of whiteness. Here's another Rose of Tralee, Belinda Brown, who's actually from London. And again, you can see for yourself the comment that was made about her underneath the picture there. She was, again, of mixed ethnicity. So that was the kind of picture which was, if you like, the first reaction in Ireland to people of mixed ethnicity, not to mention people of fully Asian or black background. Nonetheless, there were changes. By 2007, for instance, we had a mayor of Portlaoise. Portlaoise is a mid-sized Irish town in the Midlands. And one of the realities about Irish life, probably because we hadn't thought about it, was because it was relatively easy to find your way into political life. Anybody could stand, for instance, in a local election, and anybody could vote. And this particular man, Rotimi Adabari, actually began life in Ireland as a Nigerian asylum seeker, and he rose to be mayor of the town. So that indicated a certain openness. At the same time, sporting associations were among the first that were impacted by these new groups of immigrants. Sports and music, as in all countries, are the places where migrants tend to find their way in first. But here we have an example of a man who was playing Gaelic football. Gaelic football is our indigenous football here, as well as soccer and rugby, which are also popular. And this man experienced a huge amount of racial abuse from the sidelines when he was playing for his local team in a part of rural Ireland called Carlow. So, you know, we were still kind of just about getting used to the novelty of this idea. Many of the reactions might be ignorant. Some of them were openly racist. And that was characteristic of many of the events which we could see in the 2010s. At the same time, you also got the emergence of local heroes. This is my own county of Cork. And this man, Sean O'Halpine, who was half Irish and half Filipino, became a kind of a Fijian, I'm sorry, thank you. He became a cult figure. And here we have a mural on a wall in Cork, which shows the local Church of Ireland Cathedral. And he is, O'Halpine is a hurler. It's an indigenous sport again. And he is pictured here as a heroic figure, clearly of mixed ethnicity. You can see he's partly black. And that signifies to some extent the arrival of some kind of acceptance of these issues. At the top, governments struggled to handle these changes. They were formally adopting a policy of interculturalism. They appointed a minister for integration, but they brought in very few laws, very little legislation, no effective anti-hate legislation in particular. And here we have a statement which was typical, really, by a man who was actually Minister for Integration himself. And he said, when the president and ministers travel to the Middle East, they accept cultural requirements of the country and the culture they're operating in. It is, as he puts it, not very grammatically, a vice versa situation with regard to Ireland. In other words, if you want to live in Ireland, you have to do things our way and assimilate. And that continued to be the dominant message, even though there was also a discourse of interculturalism, which was often not honoured in practice. Here we have then another question that arises. How do those reactions compare with the prevailing debates in Europe in recent years? And I'll take about another 10 minutes, so I'm going to have to skip a lot of slides here. And here is the kind of language which we've seen in a whole series of European countries in recent years. You have there the AfD, which is a far-right German racist party, which actually has a substantial number of seats, not only in the Bundestag, but also in individual Länder. Beside it, you have the Front National in France, and it's very clear what their message is. Choisissez votre banlieue, choose your suburb. Do you want a place where you have to wear the hijab, this idea of the Islamification of Europe, or do you want to be a free French woman with your tricolour on your cheek? The ones on the right are interesting because on the lower right-hand corner, you can see Mr. Nigel Farage, probably responsible more than any other politician in the UK for what has become a reality now, Brexit. The British have left the European Union. And you can see behind a photograph which was hugely circulated in the UK at the time. They're actually of refugees. They're all male. This is the time of the Syrian refugee crisis, so it's easy enough to imagine where they came from. And what this kind of image is suggesting really is that we need to take back control and stop all of these foreigners coming here. And the top image is from Hungary, where there was also a far-right government headed by Mr. Viktor Orban. And I find it interesting that the photograph has literally been stolen from Mr. Farage, because if you look at it, it's the same photograph. And again, the image is that Europe is being invaded by the foreigner. Here we have an Austrian right-wing party, and the slogan here is that this woman that you see is too pretty, too beautiful for a veil. So again, it's the Islamification that's being got at here. And then I'm sure you've all heard the Lega in Italy, Mr. Salvini, and their message, stop the invasion. These are some of the Irish equivalents, just to show that it also happened here. George Soros features as a hate figure in all of this right-wing propaganda. Not a coincidence, I think, that Soros is Jewish. Here we have another one, Ireland 2040, and a picture of a number of probably refugees, probably having got off a boat, maybe in the English Channel rather than Ireland. But the image is very clear that Ireland will be Africanized unless we stop this invasion of the foreigner. And then here we have a poster which was put up all over a very famous town in Ireland, Killarney. And it was put up just before there was to be a ceremony where new citizens were to be given their citizenship papers. And as you can see, the slogan is, "You'll never be the Irish," which is a play on a sporting slogan they used to have on the terraces, "You'll never beat the Irish." And again, what you have here is a set of very ugly caricatures of people of various kinds of foreign ethnic origin. And clearly the message it is sending is not one of welcome. And then we have a whole series of more images here. I won't dwell on them today, but what you have here is images of, once again, Islamophobia. The Islamic Conquest Centre of Ireland is the name given here to what in fact is the Islamic Cultural Centre of Ireland. Here we have a picture of an event, a cultural event held to celebrate Irish Muslims. And in the centre of the picture you have, he was then the Prime Minister of the Taoiseach, and his name is Leo Varadkar, who is in fact himself half Indian, which again is an indication of the scale of change here. And here we have the current Lord Mayor of Dublin, Hazel Chu, who is half Irish and half Chinese, and has been the subject of absolutely relentless online abuse and attacks from these right-wing sources. But all that said, the point I want to make is that they have no influence. They have really little impact. They have no seats in Parliament. They have no seats in local councils. And while they make a lot of noise in social media, we haven't actually seen any breakthrough by these far-right forces at any time in recent years, which is interesting considering the sheer scale of the change that Ireland has undergone since the mid-1990s. Now let's look at a few positive aspects of all this. This is a movement I belong to myself, Cork City of Sanctuary, and it's a movement of voluntary associations, migrants, asylum seekers, teaching organisations, schools, the university, the city council, the Garda Síochána, who are the police force of the country, the health services. They're all in this movement together, and it's to build a set of grassroots, bottom-up alliances with new migrants, whether they're asylum seekers or whether they're migrants, whether they're workers, whether they're black, white, it doesn't make any difference. And very many of the people now becoming involved are young people. So here we have some of the actions which we've tried to push. This one emphasizes the importance of becoming involved in the political system and working to change politics from the inside. So training courses in engaging migrants in politics, instructions about how to become involved as a voter. How do you register to vote? How do you campaign for people if you want to be involved? How do you put forward particular policies to bring about change at local level? A book here published in 20 languages and 3 photographers representing Albania, Brazil and Poland, again giving you an idea of the sheer variety of people who now live in this country. World music. Music is huge in Ireland of all kinds, from classical to traditional to hip hop and everything in between. And that has been one of the major routes into Irish society for foreigners settling here. And music has proved a particularly useful vehicle for getting people to know each other. And these kind of events now take place regularly. And here we have a mother and baby group course organized. And most of the people in that photograph there, and I know a number of them, are asylum seekers. And over time, it's hoped that when they do come to settle in Ireland in a permanent fashion, that they at least will know something about our culture and that we will know something about theirs, that it's a mutual learning experience. Again, Africa Day, I won't dwell on this. Women's groups becoming very active. And then this is a good example of something which we saw last year, and that was the response to the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, in particular the murder of George Floyd. And I've no doubt that you had similar responses in Brazil. I'd be interested to hear what they are. The Cork response was this event, a youth forum, Cork Migrant Centre, Youth Initiative Against Racism. Again, a big event which they organised themselves, which was attended by the Lord Mayor, by some senior police officers, and by various other people. So some reasons for hope there that we can actually build a different and a more open and new Ireland. And another figure who's very big for us here in Cork is a famous abolitionist. I'm sure you've all heard of him, Frederick Douglass. And Douglass actually came to Cork, this is almost incredible, in 1845 on the eve of the famine. He himself was a friend of Daniel O'Connell, the liberator. And Daniel O'Connell was an abolitionist and strongly supported it, which, by the way, not all his counterparts in Irish America did. So we had a Douglas Week here just a month or two ago, in fact, which was a major event. Most of it was online, obviously, and thousands of people attended that week, in which we considered, where do we go next? How do we revisit the Irish legacy, for instance, of being part of a white supremacist conquest of other parts of the world? How do we consider what changes we need to make in our own society to make people coming here from elsewhere feel more welcome? So Douglas has become a kind of a key figure in all of this in Ireland. So conclusions, very briefly. I would say, first of all, and I'm probably stating the obvious here, Ireland has become a more open and porous and linked nation, linked to other countries, and within we're also more linked. Up to half of recent Irish emigrants, as mentioned already, have returned. We've seen large-scale immigration, including the arrival of asylum seekers and refugees, and that has been a feature of Irish society since the 1990s. Most of these people are here to stay. So modern Ireland is now a more open nation, characterised by high migrant flows and stocks. Flows meaning people moving in and out, and stocks meaning what part of that population becomes a permanent part of society here. There are some factors outside Ireland playing a role in determining this, but I won't go into those today in the interest of brevity. In terms of multiculturalism, we are accommodating ourselves to a multicultural society, but it's a long way from perfect yet. We don't really have effective policies, and there have been serious incidences of racism in the street in particular, and we've had murders. We've had events of that kind, which would indicate that we have quite some way to go yet. The official ethos and policy lags behind all of these local initiatives that I've been trying to describe. And what I said already, there is some evidence of this far-right populist xenophobic movement that you have across Europe right now, regrettably, and of course elsewhere. It doesn't have much political traction so far, and I would put the reason for that down to the point I made earlier, that there are two strands in the history of Irish nationalism. There's the kind of blood and soil essentialist strand on the one hand, and then there's the other more political, French influenced, the French Revolution, that strand on the other. And I think the second one is dominant. And one political party here has played a particularly important role, because the party which is known as Sinn Féin, often thought of as a hardline party of republicanism, it also occupies the space which in another country might well be occupied by a hardline racist party, and they are not. So they have been a significant bulwark against the emergence and development of racist sentiment in Irish political life. And I just want to finish then with a couple of slides simply to show you that the Brazilian presence here has come to matter. This is a Brazilian website, as you can see. Well, it's actually an Irish Brazilian website. It's called Brazilians in Ireland. And this is the front page of their website, which tells you something about the presence of Brazilians. And there's one town then in Ireland called Gort, which in Ireland has come to be called Little Brazil. And these are pictures of some of the events which have taken place there yearly. They came to Ireland in the early 2000s, principally to work in the local meat industry. But since then, they have become very much part of the community. 30% of this town of Gort are now composed of people born in Brazil. Gort is famous for other reasons, because it's near the home of Lady Gregory, and also it's where W.B. Yeats bought a castle called Tour Ballylee. So it has that specific location in the traditional Irish literary landscape, But nowadays it's also got another location, and there's an annual festival there every year. There's been a lot of intermarriage between Brazilians and Irish locally, and they're now widely welcomed and accepted. So I suppose it's nice to finish on a positive note, but I don't want to suggest that everything is perfect. So thank you very much.
Wow, thank you very much, Professor. Oh my God, what a amazing lesson. I think we will be here the whole afternoon listening to your talk. You know, my students, okay, my students are here. I know how happy they feel at the moment. Fernando, I know that Fernando is more, what he has done is more connected with your talk, but I think all of us have learned a lot. Your talk is really plenty of experiences and knowledge and science, sciences, and thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for your generosity in accepting our invitation. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. But I should add as well that it is now for us. We have been great at saying what wonderful people we are, but actually, it's for us, the Irish, now to learn more from those countries which have much more experience than we have in dealing with the realities of multicultural society. And I would hope that we can have those kind of contacts as well between Ireland and Brazil. I don't mean that you've got everything right there either, but I think we have much to learn.
Yes, we have. We need to meet you in the future to learn more. This was not enough. I have many questions to ask you, but I think time is over. I'm not able to ask you today, but in the future I'll send you messages to ask you. But let me see if some students want to ask you any question. I leave for them. Oh, thank you, Lara. Thank you so much. What a great presentation. From Buenos Aires, delighted to hear the presentation by Piers, a former colleague.
Critical questions are welcome.
Okay, any question? Or when Laura finishes, we can have.
Good idea.
Okay, let's move to Professor Laura Zaha. Professor Laura Zaha from University of São Paulo. Laura Zaha is a coordenadora da Cátedra de Estudos Irlandeses, WBH, vice-presidente e diretora da Agência USP de Cooperação Acadêmica Nacional e Internacional. A pesquisa da professora Laura é sobre literatura das diásporas e imigração irlandesa para o Sudamérica. Então, welcome, Laura. Let's listen to your talk now.
Good afternoon to everybody. Thanks a lot for your invitation, Noelia. And it's really a great pleasure to be here with all your students and all the audience that are attending us. I would like to thank Piers for your brilliant lecture, bringing exactly all this new landscape of Ireland, because from the other side of the Atlantic as we are, and of course the majority of the Irish immigration is in Argentina, and I thank Justin Harman, who was the ambassador in Argentina and now the president of the Association of Irish Studies in the South, as it is called, the association now, is here present, and there is still this idea of the past, of all this mythical, imaginary of what it means to be Irish. but at the same time to be Irish abroad, and how the image of Irishness is somewhat crystallized or even in our own minds. So it's so good to have this panorama that you have given us. And of course, I know that you have much more material, and that it would be fantastic to have a kind of a long course or a short course in the near future about this, because it is a way of updating our imaginaries, because we are still always somewhat idealistically seeing the other, instead of trying to articulate all these things that are occurring nowadays. For example, you ended your lecture talking about Gork and all the Brazilians there who went at the very beginning for the meat industry. I remember more than nearly 20 years ago or 15 years ago that there was an announcement, an advertisement in the newspapers, on the newspapers, saying that they were butchers were needed in Ireland, and the majority of them start moving there. So, but then we have now on the news all the issues of a bit of a xenophobic way of treating people from abroad, and some Brazilians. And I know that this is something that is very specific in different places, but nevertheless, as you mentioned, it is there, and all of us in the world have to learn how to live all together in harmony. Nobody is in competitions here. So thanks a lot, and I think we can expand this later. My talk is very informal, so and I will try to be short, but please, in any case, you tell me. I will start just referring to the emigration to Argentina as going to the unknown at that moment when it started. But it is interesting to recall Appadurai and Breckenridge, who once wrote that, and I quote, "Diasporas always leave a trail of collective memory about another place and time, and create new maps of desire and of attachment." So I think that this is interesting, because literature is a space of memory and imagination, of fractured and variously interconnected spaces of knowledge that recreate the past and presents maps of experiences of belonging and becoming, fictionally or in their autobiographical writings. Thus, I'd like to start this talk crediting literature for being the privileged space of memory and imagination, a space of life. In his Nobel Prize lecture, Seamus Heaney credits poetry, saying, and I quote, "for making possible a fluid and restorative relationship between mind's center and its circumference, for its truth to life." He affirms poetry, and I quote again, "can make an order as true to the impact of external reality and as sensitive to the inner laws of the poet's being." So I think that literature makes us re-experience the experience of the others. I speak from the field of literature in general. It is the space of possibilities, I would say, possible dreams that transform imaginaries, possible reconfigurations of social, political, and historical relations, possible physical and cultural crossings, possible crossings of space and time. Literature is always at a turning point. It is movement in continuum. It rewrites past and present myths in order to visualize the future. And now we are receiving some kind of literary texts from all these asylum groups that are staying in Ireland, like Melato, who wrote about her own experience there. So in asylum houses, so and many other painters trying to translate their own experiences through their paintings. So I think that it's a way of trying to experience and to put ourselves in their own shoes, as we said. In the literature of the diaspora, physical, cultural, and psychological crossings provoke feelings of loss and hope, the dialectical forces of victimization caused by the sufferings of emigration, and on the other hand, of celebration of the achievements attained away from home. These forces are in constant tension and friction. However, the myth of the return is also very strong and brings the diasporic subject back to an idealized past while they are struggling for a utopian future. Nightmares and dreams configure the state of the mind of the migrant. So the long journey home is present in the Irish imaginary. This walk towards home, towards a mythic place, because it's not the home that they left behind, the mythic place also of desire in the diasporic imagination, a place of no return, is a continuum of feelings as a spectrum is a continuum of color from red to violet, for example. I would like to share my screen, so it's just to, do you see it? No? Do I have to come back? Okay, share. Oh my God. Let's see. No, stop screen. Is it there now? I don't see any messages, so I don't know what is happening. Go back to slides. Yes, I already did. Let's go back again. Can you see it?
It's great now. It's okay. But
yes, it's okay. Okay,
yeah,
so I
for
will.
me, I can see emigration
yes.
to Argentina. Okay, better,
Okay.
much better.
Thank you. All right. So it's just for you to see at the very beginning that map and to keep in mind all the travels that people do coming out from Ireland, going to Liverpool, and then crossing the Atlantic, a very long journey at that time. So what I'm going to do is to speak about the Irish immigration very quickly. And already Pierce has mentioned how many millions of people claim Irish ancestry. So I think that this number is also a bit lower than Pierce's number. I will refer to the sense of place and the diasporic identities, and also the founding myths in a symbolic level, what it means to be Irish in Argentina. So medieval writings had consecrated on a symbolic level a powerful myth in the history of the great sea voyages, the so-called Fortune Islands, the Islands of the Blessed, the Tirnanog, the Promised Land, where perpetual spring and eternal youth reign, and where man and animals coexist in peace according to the Phoenician, Celtic, and Iberian legends. In the first chapter of his book, Deconstructing Ireland, Colin Graham introduces Ignatius Donnelly's thesis with the purpose of recreating a variety of signifying possibilities of Ireland. And in his book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, written in 1882, the Irish-American lawyer, politician, and writer sets out to prove that the sinking of an entire civilization is geophysically possible and reconstructs this lost paradise of the Atlantis in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Of course, that this is imaginary, but he believes that Ireland, placed in the strategic geographical position east of the legendary island, was colonized at an early day by the overflowing population of Atlantis. He also refers to St. Brendan and his mythologized attempts to find the mystical land of Tir na Nog, or the Americas, as a symbolical journey in search of his lost Atlantean origins. So I think that this idea by Donnelly is a way of bringing this idea that Ireland is a space for immigrants at that time, very far away, something that is in his imaginary, but also a space for emigrants, for going, for moving away to other countries. So his Ireland is a utopian space, a Tir na Nog which is fated never to return and never to be arrived at. Graham brings all the example of John, also other examples, but he refers specifically to a work of art by Sean Hillen, who in 1999 published a book, Paper Collages, entitled Irelantis. And Fintan O'Toole introduces this publication, saying that Irelantis is contemporary globalized Ireland, a society which became postmodern before it ever quite managed to be modern, a cultural space that has gone. But this Ireland is also everywhere and nowhere, end quote. So, according to Fintan O'Toole, it is this idea of Ireland dissipating itself, that's to say, the disappeared islands and the new islands that come out from that. And Luke Gibbons also refers to it, saying that we are getting the last glimpse of a world that is lost. So I think that perhaps we can make some references to whose world is the one that has been lost, is the one I think that Pyrrhus has just described. So Graham concludes that Irelantis is a manifestation, somewhat ironic, of the dreams which have been floating out there, a metaspace which is indisputable everywhere and nowhere. So if we come to the idea of the different waves of Irish immigration in the reversal way now, that's to say, not going to Ireland, but the Irish going abroad, I would say that we have different periods of time and different causes that brought the Irish, especially to South America, and I will, of course, focus in Argentina. So from the 16th century, we have the Christian utopia that became real with the Jesuit missions in the north of Argentina, Paraguay, and south of Brazil, led by Father Thomas Fihili, an Irishman from Limerick who arrived to the River Plate in 1587. So that was the Tir na Nog, we would say, the promised land, Canaan's land, in 19th century hard times, when the Irish emigrated due to the Great Hunger and eviction. English invasions also in the 18th century to Colonia del Sacramento in Uruguay, and then to Argentina, to Buenos Aires, with the coming in the army of the British, and many of them deserting and staying in Argentina and participating in San Martin's Army of Liberation. So it is a way of contributing to the land that has received them. In 1820s, we have the Irish Yankees who became part of the craftsmen of the city of Buenos Aires, and they configure a kind of Irish elite who settled also that in a way, in contrast to this Irish elite who settled in the countryside without mixing with the natives. These craftsmen were the ones especially who worked in the railway constructions in Argentina. In 1827, we have just coming to Brazil a group of people from Cork who were the mercenary soldiers, who were going to fight against Argentina in order to get the land of Uruguay um, uh, to have that land. But then, of course, it was not successful, and then they have to return back to different places in Brazil. And finally, the great exodus, we would say, was the one provoked by the Great Hunger in between 1844 and 1852, and the different groups of Irish coming to Argentina, who was called a kind of chain migration, was led by Father Anthony Faggi, that he was the one who kept the community very endogenous and taking care of them, even of weddings, in order to keep their own culture alive, and we would say without any contamination from the natives. The places that they came, and this is the source coming from Edmundo Murray's MA dissertation, that he tried to follow the trail of the Irish from the very origin of their emigration, is that they came from Longford, Westmeath, Wexford mainly, and then of course they follow all the propaganda, we would say, of how good it would be for them to come to these unknown lands, right? So that's why it was announced Liverpool. That was the way that the ships, the ports that the ship passed through, from Liverpool to Brazil, and then the River Plate. We had this kind of announcements, that is the sacralization or sublimation of the place that they will go to, the land of opportunity, as it was called. That's say this idea of having opportunities of being owners of the land, also because of the climate. So even here in Brazil and in Argentina, there were laws passed in order to receive these immigrants. And the first stop that they have when they arrive in Buenos Aires is the immigrant hotel. That we could see here how also at some moments it couldn't cope with the great numbers of people, of immigrants, that Buenos Aires was receiving at that time. The newspapers of the time were also incentivizing, we would say, the immigration coming especially from Europe. And in different periods of the history of Argentina, we are going to have governments that will support the coming of all kinds of immigrants. But also, for example, with Sarmiento, he didn't want immigrants to come from the south of Europe. He privileged the north of Europe, let's say, the Anglo-Saxons and people from the north of Europe, because he said that especially the Italians were anarchists at that time. What is interesting is that all these newspapers construct, we would say, the mode, the identity of the people at that time. They had the aim of constructing this and keeping their culture alive, not to lose it. We have many travel writings, and in these travel writings, there is this kind of sacralization of history, referring to this country of the future. Even the Brazilian flag has this idea, order and progress, right? So that was the moment of the propeller for people to leave their country and to come to these unknown lands. We also have Marion Murphy Mulhall, who was her husband and brother-in-law were the owners of the Standard, one of the newspapers in Buenos Aires, and newspapers who in a way represented the Irish community, but the Irish community in favor of the Union, we would say. And they made many travels around across Argentina and across Brazil, and it was a way of mapping, of building up a cartography of the places that they were visiting, and mentioning in the handbook of Brazil, for example, which are the most productive lands for people to come and settle, and also in Argentina. There were many narratives of adaptation and reaffirmation that comes from the journals of their communities, the newspapers of their community. And for example, in the Southern Cross, we could see even iconically how they refer to these Irish symbols. And at the very beginning, when it was founded, the motto of the newspaper was, and I read, "We are in the first place Catholics, then Irish, and lovers and admirers of our new adopted country. We are liberal in politics, conservative in religion, respectful of the opinions of others, and well disposed toward all." So in this sense, you have the enumeration shows the priorities that they were giving to the construction of their identity far away from their own home. So this ambivalence of home is very much present. It is a new Ireland that they were constructing within a new nation. Thus, the physical borders remained and were also recreated in the diasporic mind. So those texts have become an important means of understanding the various kinds of diaspora experience that they have in their own different private levels and also public levels in relation to the context that they were living in. They were constructing a kind of symbolic textuality and a strategy of survival in order to represent this transnational movement, but at the same time showing that they were not affected by it. In 1884, now we see that there is a change in that motto, and of course that these the changes occur because of the different historical and political situations that was taking place in Argentina. So in 1884, we are going to have organ of Irish and Catholic interests in the River Plate. So there is this idea of impulse of industries and of also trying to accelerate the importation of goods from Ireland at that time. But of course, it is Irish first and then Catholic interests in the River Plate, when before we have the other way around. First of all was religion the main issue. William Bulfin is a very important character, we would say, and historical figure in Argentina. He was the editor of the Southern Cross in between 1896 and 1906, and he wrote short stories about the Pampas, about the people in the camps, and it is interesting to read them because we see how he appropriates the language of the natives in his own writing, and his writing was in English. And he was also the Southern Cross represents the nationalists. That's to say, he was a strong supporter of the nationalist movement in Ireland. And he had the Gaelic League and established a branch of the Gaelic League in Argentina. And he also sent money back to Ireland to support that movement. But he was supporting also the national Irish school, that's a university for the descendants or the new generation in Argentina to be able to go back to Ireland and to study in Ireland and not to stay in this foreign country. In his photographs that were these are photographs taken by him that were in the family, and that Anne McBride White had given them to me, shows how Buenos Aires was like at that time. He wrote sketches of Buenos Aires that are published in the newspaper in the Southern Cross, and he signed as Che Buono. But in these photographs, we could see how the immigrants were living in specific places that were constructed for them till they could get a job and go to the camps to work, or to have any other kind of jobs. And it is interesting to say that the women that arrived in Argentina became teachers, and that William Bulfin, and especially other Irish people there, they didn't want them to become to work in the domestic service. They try for them to get married, or just to work as teachers and governors in Irish families in order to keep their language alive. So these are just photographs to show how Buenos Aires was at that time. And then there are other photographs that in a way emphasizes the narratives of compensation. That's to say, look at that. They could have their own cattle, they could have their own land, and sheep, they could raise sheep. So this is the way of showing how fortunate people would be if they come to the country, to this new land. These are also cultivations, but an important thing is that he was really alerting the people back in Ireland, saying that the tragedy which underlies these lines is that of a country bleeding to death. Every shipload of shy-eyed Culeens and lads so straight and tall that crosses the ocean from home ports is a gush of life blood pulsed out from an open artery by the heart of Ireland. So with this, in 1900s, when he wrote this, and then after 22 years living in Argentina, he went back home. He tried to show how dangerous this emigration in great numbers, this Irish diaspora was for the country. And he also complains about that in Rambles in Irene, when he refers to the heroes, the Irish heroes in the battles of independence in this new land, and saying that they should have stayed in Ireland and fought for their own independence rather than for the foreign independence. But all the stories that were told were male, the majority of them malish, let's say, and at the same time of great success. But we also have in the history of the Irish immigration to Argentina a story that was not successful at all, and it is the Dresden affair that brought narratives of oppression, narratives of death, because it was the moment that on 16th February 1889, more than 1,500 Irish people, Irish immigrants, arrived at the port of Buenos Aires, and they didn't have space or houses to give to them till they find a job, and they were sent south of the province, 800 kilometers south of the province, near the Bahia Blanca, a city down there in the province of Buenos Aires, that was a salty place, completely igneous. They couldn't work in the land, and after 2 years, more than 200 children died, as well as people, and they had to come back to Buenos Aires, even walking, most of them, and died on their way. So these are just announcements and articles that appeared in their newspapers. I know that I have to rush, so I will not read that, but just to emphasize this idea of how to construct an identity away from home, is this idea of recreating in a very paradoxical way the idea of going towards a new land, but at the same time leaving behind their own home. Let's say this hope is this idea of loss and hope at the same time, with this also the desire to return. As I mentioned to you, that this, in relation to the different historical periods in Argentina, we have this, the newspaper headings show us which are the real strategies of a culture of survival. So in 1910, for example, they were celebrating the first government, autonomous government in Argentina. So they try to amalgamate their symbols, Irish symbols, but at the same time representing that period. And also when they were celebrating their 100 years, you see the very front cover of the special number of that newspaper. It was a magazine, and it was this idea of Argentina receiving Ireland, we would say, in the very figure as we could see, and all the symbols, the Irish symbols, being present as if they were completely amalgamated and integrated to the country as they were at that moment. But then the newspaper was written in English, but little by little the newspaper turned to be bilingual. And it turned to be bilingual because of the different situations, as I mentioned, historical and political situations. Especially in 1982, it turns nearly completely into being written in Spanish because of the Malvinas War. And as you see, the idea of writing La Cruz del Sur was smaller in time before the Malvinas War, but then in the end, the only thing that is present is the Southern Cross in English. But then everything, the front pages will be in Spanish. throughout these mottos, we see how they are changing and constructing their identity. And in the end, when it was 125 years, we are going to see that Argentina is very little. It's very small. It's the flag there, and the shamrock is what really comes out from the front page. Why? I think that this is a kind of revival that was occurring in Argentina of the Irish culture, because at that time there was the young people were amalgamating to the culture of the countryside. They were also dressing as gauchos, going to parties dressed like that, and it was an effervescence of the Argentine culture. But then I think that the Irish community wanted to bring back this third generation, fifth generation back to their own habits and culture. And perhaps Justin could add more to that than I myself, because it's more than 45 years that I don't live in Argentina, but it was something that struck me when I went there for my research and see these changes in the community and in the general people at that time. So you see, if we put together these two covers, when it was 100 years and then 125 years of the Southern Cross celebration, it tells a lot. There are many writers and many publications nowadays that are coming out focusing more the present, that's to say, after the Malvinas War onwards. But it is interesting because these new publications and studies that we are doing try to bring back to the historiography of the Irish community in Argentina these writers that have been writing about Argentina, about the Irish in Argentina, or that they are Irish also in their ancestries, and that have been completely left aside, we would say. Borges, because he has some short stories and articles and also studies on Joyce, for example, that really promoted Irish culture in Argentina. Maria Elena Walsh wrote a very important book, despite she is a singer, for children, and wrote also stories for children in Novios de Antaño, that say boyfriends of the past, that brings the story of her own grandmother. Rodolfo Walsh, who was part of the political leftist movement in Argentina, Montoneros, he disappeared. He's one of the missing people because of the dictatorship. And then he wrote a lot about his childhood in Irish schools. Juan José Delaney is a contemporary writer, also recovering the stories of the Irish community and fictionalizing them at the same time. Marcos Aguin is referring to Almira Brown. And then we have Irish writers like Colin Toybin, who wrote The Story of the Night, that he referred to especially the moment of the Malvinas War in Argentina. And we have Mario Vargas Llosa, just to recall, but this has to do with Brazil, El Sueño del Celta, that refers to Roger Casement. But the sense of place that is being constructed, I think it's interesting to recover what I said at the very beginning from Seamus Heaney, that he says that it is the sense of place is being given by the geographical country and the country of the mind. And Pyrrhus, who is from the geography department, knows very well how strong is the presence of the land in the construction of an Irish identity. So according to Heaney, he said that oral culture that is inherited unconsciously, plus the literary culture that is experienced consciously through books and this cultural diaspora, we would say, is what creates a sense of place. So the stable element of history is land, because land marks continuity. And in the historiography of the Irish in Argentina, we have the first book by Murphy, Thomas Murphy, who wrote in 1919 the story of the Irish, and also the historians Corol and Hilda Sabato, who wrote how was the immigration, the Irish immigration in Argentina, and published this book in 1981 in the middle of the dictatorship too. Edward Mulhall, as I mentioned before, it was misplaced this slide, but it was just for you to see how many books he wrote about trying to create a cartography of the land for the people who were coming, this chain migration coming from Ireland. And these are the books that I mentioned to you that have been published lately. And I think that it is very interesting also to highlight the books that the Embassy of Ireland in Argentina, led by Justin Harman, who we have the honor of having him here before, is the interdependence that is created in between Ireland and Argentina, and this beautiful book at the top of the screen that is Irlandeses in the City of Buenos Aires. So it is a way of trying to recover the main figures, contemporary figures in the community. Then we have books written by Irish scholars, very important, that are referring to the present of the history of the country, like Dermot Keogh in the way how the Irish independence was received in Argentina and the connection created at that time. We have also Sarah O'Brien, who, from the linguistic perspective, she interviews the Irish community, some of different generations, in order to have an idea of how these fourth, fifth generations are constructing their identity, or think the way their imaginary works in considering Irishness. We also have this later book that also refers to the Irish-Argentine identity, and Tim Fanning's book that was also translated into Spanish, Paisanos, the Forgotten Irish, who changed the face of Latin America, that he refers to all this history of contribution being done by the soldiers in the wars of independence. And first of all, just to mention also Edmundo Murray, that I mentioned at the very beginning, that he started recovering letters of families corresponding from Argentina to their family in Ireland, and he published that book in two languages. And my book is more a kind of book that tried to gather the literary texts, just to end Irishness. What does it mean? And then I'm very happy that Pyrrhus started with Declan Kuyper's Inventing Ireland, because I want to finish with Declan's ideas of Ireland. And he asks there, what does it mean living outside Ireland? And according to him, he writes The experience of exiles everywhere has much in common with the cultural strategies of the Irish over the past 2 centuries. The use of psychological masks for self-protection, the idea of the lost homeland as vanished paradise, the certain knowledge that one was an other to a host people, the need in such circumstances to invent and to ignore parental connections, as both Wilde and Shaw did in London, the inventive use of a new language with those who have no superstitious investment in its received protocols. If the migrant is a sign of the modern, then the Irish were modern earlier than most peoples, enduring the fate of uprooting, of learning a new language, of leaving a Neolithic civilization and settling in modern conturbations. Even those people who have moved from country to city in the past 2 generations have an experience which gives them something in common with that of immigrants. And I think that this is very telling because Declan is referring exactly to not just moving to the United States or to Australia. Of course, there are different cultures, but the language was English. While coming to other countries that they have to learn a new language, it is a bifurcation of the mind in language too. And that's why I would like to finish with Heaney's quotation that he refers to language. An old theme is the doubleness of our focus in Ireland, our capacity to live in two places at one time and in two times at the one place. That invigorating philosopher and prodigy Richard Carney has claimed this to be a distinguishing mark of what he is bold to call the Irish mind, this capacity, shared by all traditions on the island, to acknowledge the claims of two contradicting truths at the one time, without having to reach for the guillotine in order to decide either or, preferring instead the more generous and realistic approach of both and. So I think that this quotation from Heaney brings us all that experience that the Irish people had from the time of the empire and also carrying with them when they have to face a different culture and a different language. So as I mentioned, this is a very informal talk, and I hope I could sum up these ideas to you.
Thank you, Laura. I'm very, very happy. I can tell you, audience and researchers and lecturers, how happy I am. Because I think I made the right decision when I invite each of you. Because I think the contribution you are leaving here is enormous. We have to stop and see this video, listen to your talks, because they are lessons to learn. You know, they are every talk has plenty of experiences, of knowledge, of ideas that we can enrich and we can develop, enlarge. So thank you, Laura. Thank you, Professor Piaz. So now I think we have 3 questions, if I'm not mistaken. 2 questions or 3 questions. Let's start the questions for Professor Piaz. Gisele is the first one. Gee, welcome. So I'm curious to hear the idea of multicultural societies applying to Ireland. Can you read it, Professor?
I can. Sorry, should I respond now?
Yes, please do.
Well, I think first of all, it's a good question, and there are all kinds of models now of multiculturalism. We can go back to the Canadian original, and then it's kind of export to Australia, for instance, and we can examine the reasons why that has taken place. And then we can look at the European tradition, which is very much one of saying we each constitute within ourselves a nation state. And the question is, how do you become part of that society if you are a migrant or if you are from a minority? And that's particularly the case for, let us say, the German tradition, which therefore creates rather strict boundaries between self and other. And I thought that Laura's remark at the very end there was completely resonating with this point, because I think in the case of the Irish, for instance, the fact that we were both colonizer and colonized is part of our history, but so is the fact that we have always been migrants. So when we encounter the other, I think it's an encounter also with something familiar, because everybody in Ireland has that experience in their own family, maybe in their own lives even. I mean, I have, but I am not unusual. So in a sense, we can relate, I think, maybe more readily in certain respects. I don't want to exaggerate this, to a migrant coming to Ireland, because in a sense, that's already our story. But that's not the same thing as saying that we have the correct policies, or that we have really thought this through, other than in a very superficial way. And I do think there we have a challenge still in front of us. So there is a certain positive disposition, partly because of this long history of migration from Ireland. But when it comes to multiculturalism, you also need the hard policies, the things we know work, how to develop a genuinely respectful policy, for instance, on other people's cultures, what to do about multiple languages in the same community. All of those kind of questions, we're only beginning to tackle them, to face them. And they have been already, maybe for 2 generations now, in most other European countries, the matter of the subject matter of policy discussions and legislation and so on. That's new for us. And maybe the temptation is simply to borrow from other people in ways that don't always work. Like, I don't think British models of multiculturalism really transfer very easily to Ireland. On the other hand, the French one, which I know very well because I lived there, is one of really refusing the idea of having different kinds of ethnicities in one society. You must become French. So I think for us, these debates are still very new. That's probably not an answer to the question.
Okay, thank you, Professor. The next one. And this is for Laura. I'm interested in hearing. Can you read, Laura?
Okay, Gisele, indeed, the material is very restricted, I would say, in order for us to consult, especially at this time of the pandemic. We are involved in a project together with Professor Dermot Keogh, who is trying to build up, constructing a wonderful project for next year. And we are trying to see the reception of the revolutions in Ireland, but just not the Easter Rising as we did, looking in through journals and doing that research. Journals are our main source, and you need to be in the place in order to do that. And for example, to do that here in Brazil, it's in the pandemics, or in Argentina, libraries are completely closed. So it is difficult now to get to the source, we would say. But fortunately, that's why I showed in that slide a picture of all the new books that are coming out. I have just written an article on Irish studies in South America, and I mentioned exactly that till the very beginning of this century, nothing has been written about the Irish abroad in non-English speaking countries. It was more always about the Irish in English speaking countries. But then now the new generation of scholars are getting more and more interested in Latin America, in this idea of doing their research on the Irish abroad. I think that perhaps it has something to do with what Pyrrhus has presented. It is a way of seeing, well, what happened with our own people when they were abroad in other countries with a different language, and perhaps trying to learn how to deal with this immigration in Ireland that you find asylum seekers or immigrants coming from different countries without knowing the language, and they have to cope with it. So I do not know if that is the motive, but this idea of looking outside their own country to learn more about Latin America, or to learn more as the books that I introduced to you, that they were from 2017, so they are very 2016, unless Edmundo Murray that started together. We were at the same time working together in different places of the world, but not many other people were doing that. So I am really happy to know that there is this kind of interest, and these books are available, even editing houses that we know and we can get through Amazon, but there are few yet, but there are more coming. I know that there are other young scholars contacting us and trying to get the material that perhaps is more near us. So I think that Noelia's invitation was very, I'm very thankful, because in Brazil there is a lot to be done. There is a lot to be done.
Yes.
And in Argentina, it is already being done with a group of colleagues at USAL, at the Universidad de Salvador, at Universidad Nacional de La Pampa, Nacional de Córdoba. So in Argentina, academically, though it started from the community, just a social and educational community of Irish people preserving their own culture. Now we have the academy trying to study, trying to create a historiography of that, and trying to show it to the global Irish, we would say. But in Brazil, there is nearly nothing to be done, and a lot to be done, despite the immigration, as Pires shows. The immigration in Brazil of the Irish people is very, very little. But we can study the relationships between Ireland and Brazil, and diplomatic relationships also, even during the empire and after the empire, are really very exciting. A lot of material to be done, a lot of study to be done.
I know that these events, Laura, that we have been organizing, they are very important, because they are sources of material, of ideas for future students or postdoctoral students, masters, etc. So I know this, that we are disseminators of knowledge. So this is why the more we organize, the more we have to organize. Okay, next question. José Serrão, is Irishness the same homesickness? Professor Pierre, I think his microphone.
I'm not sure if I'm understanding the question. I mean, do we mean the sort of the diasporic sense of homesickness, of everything that has been lost, which is a little bit what you were touching on, Laura? Because there is another dimension to this as well, which I can see now looking at this from the perspective of living in Ireland, which is that there is a diasporic consciousness of Irishness, for instance, which is now, there is, in French we say décalage, there is a gap between that notion of identity, which is grounded in something which actually in Ireland itself has gone. I'm not sure if I'm making that clear. So yes, we are now in a different place quite often from those diasporic Irish, for instance, who come to visit, and they don't find what they're looking for because it's no longer there. So I think there is that dimension. I'm not quite sure how else to put it. Laura,
Right.
you might have
I
a
think
better idea.
you are right, because you see, that's why I started saying and speaking about talking about imaginary. It is in our imaginaries. The diasporic mind is lives in the imaginary of their left back home. That's say of what they left back. But when they come back, that at that time in the 19th century, when they leave, they couldn't come back at all. And nowadays, diaspora is a term that is used in a very, how do you say, broader way, referring to laboral diaspora and other kinds of diaspora. But nowadays, with the communication, we can go back home. And that is, I think, it's the great gap that we couldn't build a bridge between that gap, because when you go back home, then you realize that the home that you left was not the same at that moment. You are being treated as a stranger also. You are a foreigner. You do not belong to this place anymore. So this idea of when they couldn't go back home, they still have that in their imaginary. But now that there is that possibility of coming and going, for the diasporic mind, it is an imaginary diasporic mind. And then when they get back, reality is completely different. So homesickness is in the imaginary, I think.
Oh, thank you very much. Oh, you're going to say something? Okay, go on, Professor.
Well, no, I was just going to add something, actually, because when you say homesickness, of course, you remind me of what I think is the greatest short story ever written by an Irish author, and that is George Moore's Homesickness, which was published in 1906. And that's a story which actually bears out what you just said, Laura, because this is a man who has emigrated to America, and he's living in the Bowery in Manhattan, and it's full of the life of that city at the time. And then he comes back to Ireland, and the title of the story is a kind of a play on words, because it's coming home which makes him sick, and he ends up going back to this place. So it's a very interesting reflection on the ambiguity of this term homesickness.
Exactly.
Anyway,
thanks that you remember that. Yes, thanks that you remember John Moore's famous story. Yes, very good.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to move to the next lectures.
Okay.
Because at 4:30, it's my book lunch. And
thank you, Noelia, and thanks, Pires, for your brilliant talk. It was really very
interesting. Stay here, yes, because they're going to listen to Irish songs.
Yes, we will continue.
Yes. when the
thank you both. It was an honor and a pleasure.
Okay. Lara, Fernando, and Rosie, my team now. Okay, the next lecture is Fernando Biagini. So Fernando has a, can you please, Fernando, show the title of your presentation?
Hi, everyone. Can you see my screen? I think it's loading now. Can you hear me well?
It's perfect.
Okay. So, hi, everyone. My name is Fernando. I'm a student at UFBA and a researcher at Aris UFBA. So, I'm going to make a presentation about the research I'm doing on the science fiction and fantasy literature in Ireland. It is mostly a market analysis, a brief market analysis. So a while ago, I asked myself two quick questions that drove me to make this research, to start researching about this topic. One of these questions is, fantastic elements permeate Irish literature from the classics to modern books. How's the state of the market for fantasy literature nowadays in Ireland? Is it significant when compared to other genres? I do not mean to say any kind of literature is significant or insignificant. I just want to compare the literary genres and see what kind of market share they have, specifically the sci-fi fantasy literature in Ireland. So, according to the author and editor Jack Fennell, in the introduction chapter of A Brilliant Void, published in 2018, this is a sci-fi short stories collection published by Trent Press. So according to Jack Fennell, yes, it turns out that there is such a thing as Irish science fiction. In fact, if you look at the history of Irish storytelling, it becomes clear that Ireland has always been inclined that way. So he mentions quickly the Irish revival that brought back a lot of Celtic mythological elements to Irish literature. He mentions Liug, the hero of the Tuatha De Danann, which is the grandson of Balor, another character, a villain. And he makes this parallel between Liug and Balor with Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, meaning that Celtic mythological stories already shown elements of fantastic literature. We can also he also mentions Nua the Silver Arm from the Invasion Cycle, which he says is basically a cyborg, a proto-cyborg, for example. He also mentions the Gothic literature, with which try to incorporate a lot of fantastical elements, kind of playing with that thing that that the story is about a psychological terror, but also infers that there are fantastical elements in certain stories. For example, in Bram Stoker Dracula's. He also mentions the Iceland poetry. He mentions Jonathan Swift. Gulliver's Travels is mostly considered a satire, but it has a lot of proto sci-fi elements in it. He mentions Samuel Beckett and also Flann O'Brien, who are not necessarily, obviously, sci-fi fantasy authors, but we can see these fantastic sci-fi-ish elements in their literature, in their books. So this is a keyword cloud of the most searched words that people used when they are searching for books, for example, specifically Irish people inside the Irish market. So we can see here that the most popular words are history, modern, world, life, but we can also find here magic, we can find adventures, we can find trilogy, which is a common format in sci-fi fantasy literature. So we can see that fantastical elements might not be the most popular elements that people are searching for in literature in Ireland, but they exist. So there is a market for it. Maybe there is a market for it. This is a little snapshot, historical snapshot about the book industry in Ireland. So we can see that from starting from 2008, when the financial crisis happened, there is a steep fall in the sales in the Irish book market, and from starting from 2015, this sales started to pick up again. So I was asking myself, what drove people to buy less books in Ireland? One thing that happened around 2009 is the popularization of the electronic books, the ebook. So this maybe, and we know that this popularization impacted the book industry worldwide. So maybe it also impacted the Irish book industry. So we can see here that that from 2015 onwards, the sales start to pick up again. So is there another element that also impacted this rise? That's what my research is trying to answer. This is another snapshot of book sales, but the important thing here is the market share of genres. So we can see that all fiction is responsible for 25% of this market share of book sales in Ireland. All non-fiction books is responsible for 36%, and all children's, which encompasses fiction and non-fiction, is responsible for 38%. So, and we can see here, below here, that if we take a look at these books, who's the best sellers in 2015 in the Irish market, we can see that there are two Irish authors here: Paul O'Connell, who wrote an autobiography, and Graham Norton, that is a famous comedian, is a TV host, and he is also an author. But holding this book that he wrote is not necessarily a sci-fi fantasy book. The only sci-fi fantasy book that you can find here is Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling, which is a British author. Yeah, this is the only sci-fi fantasy book here, really. So there is only one Irish author among the bestsellers in Ireland. So let's take a look at the global book industry, specifically in the fantasy literature, in the fantasy literature sales around the world. So the current bestsellers, based on a search I made in Amazon in January 5th, 2021, the current bestsellers are George Martin, J.K. Rowling, Ernest Cline, he wrote Player Number One, and Brandon Sanderson. So as an example, I chose Sanderson's Rhythm of War. It was published in 2020, and it holds the 11th place for sci-fi fantasy books at Amazon, and appears among a lot of sci-fi fantasy classics like George Orwell's 1984. He's a British author. We can see also Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. Bradbury is an American author, and he's also among several Star Wars books, which is an intellectual property created by George Lucas and another American. In the last bestseller list of New York Times that I could see, which was published in July 2020, and encompasses only U.S. book sales, we can see an Irish author, Owen Colfer, and he holds the 4th place, but in the children's books category. And the book that appears in this list is the volume 6 of the Artemis Fowl series. It is called Artemis Fowl: The Time Paradox, and it was published in 2008. So it's not a recent book. And Owen Colfer is probably the most famous Irish author, Irish sci-fi fantasy author around the world nowadays. So I talked a little bit about ebooks, but I said that the ebooks caused a disruption in the literary market, but there is another disruption happening right now, and it is the independent publishing now. Um, According to a Forbes article titled "Sci-Fi Fiction and Fantasy Books Sales Have Doubled Since 2010." Since 2009, sci-fi fantasy book sales dropped 50%, while overall book sales in other categories dropped 23%. So we can see that the financial crisis and the ebook sales impacted heavily the sci-fi fantasy book sales. Um, Nowadays, the most current researchers, which I can only I could only grab a few bits and pieces. I do not have uh, I could not access on a good a complete research about this. Only this one, that is the Nielsen Bookscan, which was commissioned by Publishing Ireland. Um, uh, the current researchers include now independent publications. They're also called indie publishing, such as Amazon Sales. Amazon is probably the biggest retailer now in the world, and a lot of the indie publications are in Amazon. Amazon has a big platform for indie books. Nowadays, 48% of sci-fi fantasy book sales are indie books. So indie books are very important to sci-fi fantasy books right now. And the most popular subgenre is the urban fantasy. People may think that epic fantasy is the most popular subgenre in fantasy because of Lord of the Rings or George Martin or J.K. Rowling, but the most popular subgenre, specifically in indie publications, is urban fantasy. Now, this led me to make another question. To ask another question: is the indie market in Ireland significant? Trump Press, for example, the publisher of A Brilliant Void that I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, is an independent publisher, according to themselves. So the objectives of my research project are to trace a brief history of the science fiction and fantasy genre in Ireland, to study the current fantasy literature market in Ireland, to define who are the main Irish authors of the genre according to objective matters or parameters, like the number of sales and the acceptance by critics. I do not wish to say who is more important and who is less important. That's not the point here. I wish to use objective parameters to define who is who's most popular. And other objective is to establish whether the growth of independent publications has affected the Irish market in general and in the fantasy literature, and to write the article about that. I'm already writing this article, and I wish to finish it soon. The justification for the research project is fantastic elements permeate Irish literature, as said before, but there are few current Irish sci-fi fantasy authors with worldwide prominence, aside from Owen Colfer. It is difficult to find information about the sci-fi fantasy market in Ireland, as well as its main authors. It is necessary to gather whatever relevant information is available and to draw a cohesive image of the current state of science fiction and fantasy literature in Ireland, accounting for all the factors previously addressed. The research might prove useful for other researchers as a reference point that indexes relevant data on the topic. And that's it. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Does anyone have any questions? I cannot hear you, Professor.
Oh, I'm sorry. The microphone was.
No
So,
problem.
okay, let me say everything again. I had said that you are in the right track. I'm very proud of you, as I am very proud of your colleagues, of my team in general. Thank you very much. And let's move
Thank you,
to Lara,
Professor.
because we are quite in the end. And let's see if you have questions when Roseline finishes. So, Lara.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen.
Mhm.
All right. Can you see it?
Not yet. Oh, yes, coming.
Can you see the screen?
Yes. Okay,
Yes.
great.
All right. Perfect. Thank you. So, hello, everyone. I'm Lara. I'm an undergraduate student at UFBA and a researcher on Professor Noelia's group for 3 years now. And today I will try to be quick and present a piece that is turning into an article eventually. It is called Reimagining Irishness Through Music, an analysis of the song Dual Citizenship 2019 by the singer Denise Chyla. Well, the question that motivates me to work on this theme is, what is it to belong to a nation? We've had two wonderful presentations on the theme today, but I'm actually just going to sum up what they say and how it applies to Denise Chyla's song. So, in the book Imagine Communities, Reflections on the Origin and Spread of Nationalism by Benedict Anderson, 1986, he states that the idea of belonging to a nation and nation itself, as well as nationalism, would be cultural artifacts. That is to say, they are created by a group of people, right, who believe they share the same or similar characteristics, right? Be it something constructed, it means that this imagination of a community may change over time. And also, if we are considering a whole nation, we also have to consider that one idea of what this nation is, one idea of belonging is not enough to actually represent the identity diversity range of this very young country or nation. Well, then the goal of this presentation is to analyze, right, the song as a contemporary cultural artifact and think about the emergence of reimaginations of nation, nationality, and belonging. The object, again, is the song Dual Citizenship. Well, before talking about this emerging reimagination of Ireland, considering all the movements of immigration and the fact that these immigrants also contribute with their culture, with their own ideas of belonging, we should learn a little bit about what is the traditional, right, imagination of Irishness. in this case, in music. When we think about Irish music, we might think about Irish folk songs, right? And these Irish folk songs would be performed usually by the predominantly white population and talk about the whiteness, their Celtic roots, their Catholicism, their religion in this case, experiences of emigration and homesickness as well, right? Such as in the song Spencer Hill by the Dubliners, 1976, that talks about an experience of immigration and also homesickness, right? Um, Historical events would also be represented in these songs, such as the hunger strike, right? The song The Age of Song by Francie Valli, and also the process of decolonization and the independence of the Republic of Ireland, represented in the song Kevin Barry by the Wolf Tones. These are just some examples for you to have an idea of what the main representation of Ireland in music is like. Okay, in the pictures we have the group the Dubliners. Then Miss Chyla, by her turn, comes from a different place, um, like ideologically speaking, and another context, let's say, because instead of an Ireland that would represent emigration experiences and whiteness, she's going for the opposite. She's going to represent blackness. She's going to represent the immigrants in Ireland. All right. Dennis Chyla is a Zambia-born Irish rapper, singer, and poet. Her family immigrated to Ireland when she was 8 years old. Her father would work as a doctor in Dublin, and they moved to Limerick. Through her songs, this is not the only one. She's challenging constantly the idea of belonging, and she has gained notoriety in the concert Imagining Ireland, Speaking Up, Singing Louder. It was a televised concert in which she has performed dual citizenship. She was then celebrating blackness and multiplicity of identities and her own belonging in national television, actually, and that has generated a huge debate, I would say, online. But we will talk about that a little later. So, her first performance of dual citizenship, we can say that we have two versions of the song. The first is from the performance, which is the spoken word performance, right? And then in 2020, she released a music video with melody now to the song. The melody was produced by Murley. It's also an Irish rapper. He was born in Togo, in the west of the African continent. And in dual citizenship, she will talk about many layers of identity one person may hold. And this starts right from the title of the song. Why did she choose to say dual citizenship instead of dual citizenship? Well, it continues with the idea that Stuart Hall in 2001 has written about. He said that the postmodern individual has several identities, and the identity diversity comes with both conflicts and contradictions. That is to say, inner battles, and the idea of inner battles is actually present throughout the song. Okay, so the song will explore the question of how belonging is felt by immigrants through their own lenses, through their own voice, let's say, especially in contrast to the expectations and demands of others. So that's why she has chosen dual instead of dual. It's a wordplay in that sense. And another important aspect that is present in her song is the idea of autofiction. She narrates her experience, right? Or she represents, actually, her experience in a heartfelt performance. I mentioned that is a heartfelt performance because Anderson in 2083 would say that nationality and nationalism command profound emotional legitimacy, and this is pretty present in the song. You can feel that in the song. Leila Perhoni Voices in 2016 defines autofiction or an autofictional story narrative as a piece based on the author's experiences, feelings, and thoughts, even though readers, in this case, right, listeners, cannot tell clearly what parts are fiction and what parts are actual facts. Okay. However, we can say that the speaker from the song, okay, shares experiences of the songwriter's life, such as migration, right, immigration, and they are connected in terms of culture, languages, and feelings of homelessness. The idea of homelessness that we were discussing beforehand is present in the song as well. But instead of being an individual writing, autofiction is also able to communicate to a collectivity, right? When Denise Child talks about her experience, she's also representing, she's also speaking to a whole community who fit in this idea of belonging that she has, right? The Afro-Irish community, but not only the Afro-Irish community, but to, immigrants in general, we could say, because immigration is part of human experience, right? Moving on, I would like to also mention that rap music itself is really linked to the idea of immigration. Becky Blanchard, 1999, states that the African origins of rap are related to African oral narratives told by travelers called guides. They would represent their own notions of nation, heritage, and their stories. So the idea of belonging, right, the idea of narrating their own stories is actually present in the roots of rap music. And also, people would say that Blanchard actually says that the rhythm itself, the musical expression itself, was born in New York in 1973 as part the musical right expression of the culture of the young African American urban class, the projection of their voice for these unrepresented groups. It matches the minorities we see representing themselves in Ireland nowadays. In Ireland, the hip hop scene is not like in the very beginning, but it's not as strong as it could be nowadays. I think it's getting stronger and stronger by the day. But they had influence from the UK and from the USA rap scenes that are more traditional, actually. And also, immigration has brought different rappers to Ireland. Moving on to the song itself, I would like to talk just a little bit about the instrumental intro, because I think that when we talk about music, when we analyze a song, we should not only mention the lyrics, but also the contribution that the melody has to these lyrics, right? Because it also means something, really. The instrumental of the song is a bass sound that creates an atmosphere of intimacy, right? The song reiterates itself throughout the sound reiterates itself throughout the song, and it helps as well with the tone of seriousness that is going to be viewed, right? The rhythm of the song also reminds us of movement, which comes in handy when we are talking about migration. And in the picture, we have the scenario of the music video released in 2020. It's a light scenario, right, with green painting in it. And later on, in the beginning of the song, we see a black woman in this white scenario. If we think about this white scenario as whiteness, in general, whiteness that would be very present in the Irish society, it makes total sense, right? This woman is painting herself, green, okay, throughout the music video. Green being one color that is pretty much representative of Ireland and of Irishness. And the lyric starts with, where are you from originally? This is a question that may be asked whenever you see a black person in Ireland being Irish, you know. And then the lyrics continues to say, see, our souls are composed of borders, and all of lines that we have crossed that tangle our wires when we speak. This particular quote represents, first of all, the experience of migration and how this experience influences people and their identities, right? And also cultures and languages as well. She will proceed to talk about languages in the song. Then she goes, there are some people who will spend their whole lives looking for a definition of home that doesn't come with strings attached. Remember the idea of inner battles I was talking about before? I think this is a great representation of it. When we think about strings attached, we can think about the already preconceived and more traditional conception of Irishness or conception of nation or conceptions of belonging, right? And she says, I have spent my whole life learning that I must make myself, take my belonging. It will not just be handed to you. I think this is pretty powerful, and it states that she actually creates her own belonging, right? It's not something that is already there for her. Then she shows that she embraces her cultures, actually, that she embraces her identities and the influence the places she has been had in it. So she says, I could show you the spirit of Lucan, which is the place in the image, Limerick, and Lusaka, because I learned how to be Irish, knowing that some people would always think that I was beyond pale. I learned how to be Zambian with two little bamba to prove I haven't lost my way. This is the idea of being part. She seems to be aware that being part of a nation is something learned, is a construction, right? As it resonates with what Benedict Anderson said about cultural artifacts and imaginations. And then she goes to the part that I think is most beautiful and powerful of the lyrics. We are unashamed of our heritage. We have nothing to prove. And sometimes there is pain in these roots that our being is anchored to. But you will see beauty when this forest grows. It's an open celebration of her heritage, of her blackness, and also ancestrality. The whole song before that is written in first person singular, but now she talks about we, a first person plural, to represent that she's not only talking about herself as an individual, but also to a whole community. Okay, and then the song is finished with the phrase again, "Where are you from originally?" But there's a little bit of a twist in this part because the music video is ending. The woman that we have seen is fully painted green, and we can hear some voices in a choir, like if they were singing from some distance, right? And I see that as a representation of ancestral voices because they are not singing in English, for example, they are singing in another language. But this beautiful celebration of blackness that we have seen in her lyrics and in her music video and in other songs by Denise Chaila actually is not something easy to do. It's a challenge actually, and it could be dangerous. As Bell Hooks states, loving blackness as a political resistance transforms our ways of seeing and being. But bell hooks also says that love and blackness in a society dominated by whiteness is dangerous. And in the reception of this song, Dual Citizenship, we could see a practical example of that. In an interview, Chyla says that some far-right-winged Irish people have sent her death threats online. I think this is really serious, and we should not underestimate these kinds of movement. In Brazil right now, for example, we have people trying to celebrate the military intervention, let's say, in this very own year, the anniversary of a dictatorship, you know. So we should not underestimate that, and this is really, really serious. And as a conclusion, I would say that through the analysis of dual citizenship, it was possible to show that new intercultural sonorities, genres, and languages are finding place in the Irish music scene. As new representations and reimaginations of Ireland as a nation seem to be an ongoing process, it is already possible to say that this movement exists, and the whiteness of the traditional representations is no longer enough to define what is it to be Irish. And these are my references, if you are interested. There you have it. Thank you so much. I would like to thank especially Professor Noelia for the energy she has put into this event. She's always motivating all of us to participate and to actually promote these events. So thank you so much, Professor Noelia, and thank you to everybody who are listening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lara. Congrats. It was really brilliant presentation. I'm very happy with you all, not only with you, but Fernando, Sanyu. Sanyu yesterday was brilliant, and you and Fernando. Now comes Rosiline to conclude our successful event. So let's listen to Rosiline now.
Okay. I'm just checking if my camera and my audios are working. So
I can hear you.
John.
Okay. The floor is yours.
Can you see my presentation? I just
Not yet, Rosie.
let me see. What about now?
No.
There we go.
I think yes.
Now, yes?
Yes. Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Hi, everyone, and good afternoon too. My name is Rosiline Costa dos Santos. I am an undergraduate Letras student at Federal University of Bahia, where I am part of the Association for Research and Irish Studies, which is the research group in charge of this virtual event. Well, the reason why I am here this afternoon is to present to you the result of my last research. So the title of my today's presentation is Autofiction in Performance in Shumali, by the Irish rapper Kojak. So Shumali is a single that is part of the upcoming Kojak's studio album. To the development of this research, I made myself the following question. Why Shumali can be considered an autofictional audiovisual production? Based on that, I made some efforts to develop arguments that might confirm my hypothesis. That is, Shimala is an autofictional audiovisual production. So at this point, my main objective maybe will sound kind of obvious, which is to present to you my point of view on why I consider Shimala in autofiction audiovisual production. For doing so, I thought to myself, it would be necessary proposing some specific goals. One, to go through the concept of autofiction. Two, to reflect on the idea of reality and the idea of fiction through the concept of performance. And three, to point out the nature of the audiovisual text. Actually, this last is kind of an extra one. Well, I have chosen as my theoretical foundation Karen Ferreira Meyer's article entitled Autobiography and Autofiction, No Need to Fight for Place in the Limelight. There is a space enough for both of these concepts. Diana Irene Klinger's doctoral thesis entitled Escritas de Si, Escritas do Outro, Autoficção e Etnografia na Narrativa Latino-Americana. And finally, Patrick's article entitled The Nature of the Audiovisual Text and Its Parameters. Well, autofiction is a term that arises in the literature context in the 70 years that brings out together two notions that we normally think of as being opposite, that is reality and fiction. Revisiting some theoretical discussions about autofiction, Karen Ferreira Meyers points out that autofiction is commonly conceptualized by its difference to autobiography. So she states that autofiction is distinguished from autobiography mainly by the fact that it is not written at the end of life by someone good or great and known or shown, but can be written at any time in the life of anyone. It is different also because it does not intend to write life as a whole in one go. It rather gives fragments of life, not necessarily in a chronological order. Autofictional authors also allow themselves to reverse dates, to forget true items, to interfere with the objective truth, and to describe a subjective self without feeling guilty about doing so, because they are not bound by the autobiographical pact. Then it is not wrong to say that in autofictional narratives, the real and the fictional are functioning within a continuum, in which the result is the loss of borders or limits between these two dimensions. According to Diana's proposition, performance can be thought as a concept through which the standard notions about real and fictional within autofictional narratives can be enlarged. So she says that the autofictional text implies a dramatization of the self that supposes, in the same way that it occurs on the theatrical stage, a double subject, at the same time real and fictional, person that is actor and character. So it is not a question of think, as Philippe Lejeune does, in terms of a coincidence between real person and textual character, but the dramatization supposes the simultaneous construction of both author and narrator. That is, it is a matter of considering autofiction as a form of performance. Just to be clear, the idea of performance just mentioned means that as being fictionalized by themselves, autofictional authors choose to narrate and or to perform the fragments of their life in their own way. It means that they do not feel obliged to tell us those fragments in neutral, realistic manner, but it does not mean that they are just lying or inventing facts, since they are just telling us then through their own perspective, that is, their own truth. About the nature of the audiovisual text, Patrick says, if we accept a text as a speech act or more broadly as any instance of communication, we will conclude that an audiovisual text is a communication act involving sounds and images. It has to be said as a starting point that there are verbal text and non-verbal text, and that there are texts that combine both verbal and non-verbal sides. This statement sounds obvious, I know, but the reason why I am mentioning it is because I think it is necessary to highlight the combinatory shape of my object, not in a way to define it, but more to emphasize the kind of the object that I'm dealing with. For the object analysis, the methodology I have used is content analysis. In the method that I have selected is internal analysis. Since my focus are the non-verbal languages and the verbal languages that are structuring Shumali, as well as some narrative elements such as perspective, setting, and plot. Any external information that appears in this presentation about my object was got from websites such as GoPlank and Genius. Before I start to present Shumali, I need to remember you that Kojak is also one of the directors of the music video. During an interview, he gave the following commentary about Shumali. I gave up a live in London and it left me feeling like I'd failed and I was back where I was. So when I wrote Shumali, I was dwelling on that feeling. I'd been away so long and came back to the same situation that I'd left. Shit doesn't really change in Dublin. So I think that this speech says a lot about the narrator perspective within Shumali, which is the protagonist's desire to be a successful artist outside his hometown, because the double social context makes him feel he's kind of just walking in circles. But I need to say that he's not thinking about giving his ambitions and dream up, even he thinks he had failed at his first try. The major setting is Dublin City, covered by a cloudy and dark atmosphere. The building, and in which I hope you can read Shumali, actually is a parody of the Heineken Company building in Dublin. During the protagonist's journey through some places and spot from Dublin, we can see him interacting with another characters. Through some of these interactions, we can also see the establishment of the narrative's conflicts, such as street fighting and Catholic church robbery, just to give you some examples. So think about presenting the plot. I decided to focus on scenes that were related to narrator perspective, and since I knew I couldn't not show you the Shumali music, I made some gifs, so I really hope you can see them. Well, the for the rent when my mother raised me in the box went to the box push daisies, but it's looking at me like he could have been something. You wanna be the one they hit because I made it. I think I need to clarify some things to you on this one. So the first two lines are related to the housing crisis happening in Ireland these days. And push daisies means until the day of someone's death. Then the meaning interpretation is up to you. The second one is, remember when I used to hate the place that I lived in? It felt like a caged bird, cooked up pigeon, tried up sheep, came back to chicken. A fun thing about the event presented in these lines is that we can also see it in another Kojak's audiovisual productions, such as Where Noise and Politics is. The third one is funny how she changed and is still indifferent. This one agrees so much with what he said during the GoPlank's interview. I mean, about how, in his point of view, it seems like things will never get better in Dublin. And finally, trying to flip a crate from a couple red pennies. Used to want a nut to fill my belly. Now I want a nut to fill a 5-star plate and trees and cheese real Shumali. Actually, it is a scene from the beginning, but is also the chorus, the music chorus, which starts and closes the music video. So I think that through it, the protagonist reinforces his dream of being a rich and successful artist. And just to finish, because I feel like I was retelling you a story, at the end of the narrative, the protagonist appears tied at a tower nearby the Leaf River. Okay, so just move on to my final words. So in my opinion, Kojak does not only tell or narrate us fragments of his life, but he also presents them through the creation of a fictional universe where he plays the protagonist. Finally, I believe that if you think about autofiction and performance as lenses, in my point of view, the reason why Shumali is or can be considered in autofiction or audiovisual production is because Kojak performs as author, I mean writer, director, as protagonist, I mean actor, character, and as narrator, I mean narrator, character. And he does all of it at the same time. So these are my references, and I have finished my presentation.
Oh, thank you, Rosie. Thank you. Excellent. So with my researchers' presentations, we come to the end of St. Patrick's Week, or we come to the end of our celebration. But to close our session today, we're going to listen to a few songs before moving to the book launch. So I move it for you to listen to the songs that André Santana prepared for the audience, just to close our event. Oh, go ahead. This is what I call multiculturalism. So Irish song is crossing the border, coming to Brazil, and with a Baiano rhythm.
Northeast.
Huh?
Northeast. Brazilian Northeast rhythm.
So we're talking about this kind of migration. So this is what we call migration, moving. Agora eu vou começar meu book launch, aí você faz bem baixinho. Tá?
Tá bom.
So thank you very much for your participation. So this is the end of our event, and I hope to meet you all next year, or I hope to meet you in June when we will be celebrating Bloomsday. So now we'll be moving to a different thing. We'll be moving to a book launch, the book that I produced, or the book that I wrote for the university to be a professor, a full professor. So José Roberto and Sylvia and Gisele. Oh, Silvia! Where is José Roberto? Tudo. Is José Roberto there? Cadê Gisele? Deixa eu ver, Lara. José Roberto estava aí já. Dá um minutinho aí.
Eu estou assistindo, mas eu não sei como é que faz para eu participar. Você disse que você me convida, é isso, Noélia?
Não. Porque para entrar, teria que entrar pelo. Dá só um minutinho aí, Gi, mais Silvia, porque eu acho que alguma coisa. Deixa eu ver o que você diz.
O link eu tenho, o problema é que eu entro, mas eu não sei prosseguir a partir dali, entendeu? Como eu tinha falado, eu não sei fazer essas coisas.
Você pôs o seu nome porque na hora que você abre. Ah! Que ótimo! Ô, Zé, mas é difícil para nós todos, meu filho. Oh, desculpe.
Eu avisei que eu não sabia.
Não, você está sozinho nessa? Todos nós estamos.
Eu avisei que
Silvia
eu sou
falava dizendo, mande por e-mail.
tecnofóbico.
Tecnofóbico, né? The same. Ok, mas vamos começar esse
Tecnofóbico, iletrado.
Pois é, vamos fazer uma coisa descontraída, porque, na realidade, nunca fiz lançamento de livro, quanto mais... Já fiz lançamento de livro, mais presencial, né? Então, esse nós estamos inaugurando, né, Silvinha? Silvia já deve ter feito. Silvia já fez. Gisele nesse papo. Então, eu estou aqui com esse fundo musical aqui com André Santana aí, com um pouco de música irlandesa, para dar um toque especial ao nosso evento virtual. E eu começo falando de como esse livro surgiu. Não, esse livro teve um
Mostra
objetivo.
bem a capa, Noli. Mostra bem a capa para a gente ver.
Ele surgiu, não é? Porque eu tinha já um tempo de universidade, 28, quase 28, e já tinha chegado a professor associado, 4, estava no momento de passar para professor, para ser titular, né? Era à vontade, eu digo, só deixa a universidade no dia que chegar a titularidade. E aí comecei a preparar o material, segui a trilha do meu tigre aí, ó, que está aí presente, que ele sempre diz assim, Noli, quando a gente escreve qualquer coisa, vai no Lattes, escreve logo, não fica acumulando. Eu sempre procurei seguir essa orientação dele, tudo que ele... Até hoje, eu sempre falo para meus alunos, olha, isso aqui estou fazendo, estou lhe cobrando.
Olha que loucura. Olha o que eu estou ouvindo. Uma loucura.
Diga.
Está uma confusão, eu não estou entendendo nada. Está tudo junto.
Ah,
é? Eco.
Ah, então desliga
Tudo.
Desliga o seu microfone, Zé. Desliga o seu microfone. Pode ser que melhore.
Ah. Tem um... Desliga, baixei, Dedé. E aí, tá melhor? Melhorou agora? Ah, então liga o microfone.
Se ligar, vai dar eco de novo. Deixa ele ligar quando ele falar.
Ah, então tá. Mas vocês estão me ouvindo, tá?
Melhorou,
Parou,
né?
O eco. Ah, então tá. Deixa.
Hi. Só um momento.
Diga, Lara.
O eco pode ser por estar com algum dispositivo ligado no YouTube ao mesmo tempo que no StreamYard. Então, se estiver ouvindo a live, qualquer um de vocês em outro aparelho no YouTube, por favor, fecha, porque aí talvez resolva o eco. Certo?
Ótimo, Lara. Sem você, eu não sou ninguém. Então, eu vou voltar ao que eu estava dizendo, que esse material foi fruto da minha progressão para professor titular e que, com um ano de antecedência, eu comecei a escrever. né? Eu não deixei para a última hora, como eu vejo muitas pessoas deixando para o último momento escrever, e aí escreve 20, 30 páginas. Eu disse, não, eu não quero escrever só isso. Tenho tanta história para contar. E o que escrevi aqui, eu tentei me limitar à minha vida acadêmica. Mas sempre que escrevia algo sobre a minha vida acadêmica, eu me pegava em situações que eu digo, não, vai ter uma digressão. Eu queria contar mais, por exemplo, os eventos internacionais, que aí eu queria falar um pouco das cidades. Cheguei até a falar. Silvia e José Roberto, que fizeram parte da minha banca, que leram o meu texto, sabem que eu não deixei de falar. Mas existiam tantas histórias ligadas àqueles lugares que eu tive que me controlar para não ir mais adiante, né? Não, por exemplo, não só de viagens, o próprio mestrado, se eu fosse contar a minha história em Florianópolis, né, José Roberto, quando José Roberto me aceitou para ser a sua orientanda, são tantas as histórias para contar que até nesse momento, que é um momento de descontração, eu poderia lembrar essa história específica, só para tornar esse momento mais agradável, quando eu já tinha minha orientadora, na realidade eu queria ele desde o início, mas ele, não, ele é da área de Shakespeare, né? Ele é um shakespeariano, é um tradutor renomado no Brasil e no mundo inteiro, não iria pegar uma professora que vem da Bahia para trabalhar algo sobre a mulher na era vitoriana, que não tinha conexão muito com o que ele fazia, o que ele faz, né? E aí eu tive que aceitar outra pessoa, mas essa pessoa terminou declinando. E ele generosamente me liga um dia lá, né, Zé? E diz, não é? Ele me conta a história que a dita professora havia declinado e que eu estava solta, já estava quase na hora de entregar o projeto, né? E ele generosamente me acolheu, estabelecendo fronteiras. Eu sou professor e nós somos professores de universidade, né? Eu não esqueço jamais, né? Mas, a partir de agora, você é minha orientanda e eu sou seu orientador. Eu achei aquilo magnífico, eu digo, é isso mesmo. Né? E aí caminhamos juntos, né, até o final. E eu sou muitíssima grata por todas as revisões, né? Assim, como eu faço com meus alunos, eles me dão um capítulo, eu reviso uma vez, duas vezes, na terceira eles estão loucos. Aí eu digo, olha, minha revisão às vezes foram 5. A primeira, quando o Zé me devolveu, foi assim, fruto da intuição. Ai, que eu fiquei arrasada, porque eu achei com aquele capítulo já estava tudo pronto, está tudo maravilhoso, que eu estava supra-sumo, né? E ele, não, isso aqui é fruto da intuição, nada ainda. Aí eu fui para casa, a Munira também fez a mesma coisa comigo, engraçado. Tá? Lembro que primeira vez que eu entreguei o primeiro capítulo, a Munira, né? Desci aquela ladeirinha ali para ir para a casa da Munira, lá na Lapa, em São Paulo, eu morava na Lapa, ela lá embaixo, perto do Parque Vila Lobos, e aí ela me entregou o capítulo e disse, vá para casa e resuma. 60 páginas para um primeiro capítulo é demais. Não tenho paciência para ler. Então, a vida é recheada de tantas histórias. Né? Essas histórias eu não contei aqui, né? Porque, como era um trabalho acadêmico, eu tive que me limitar realmente a fazer o que está aqui no sumário do livro, né? O sumário de trajetória acadêmica, o antes e o depois, cursos de pós-graduação, mestrado e doutorado, retorno à UFBA após mestrado e doutorado, atividades administrativas, estágio de estudos no exterior, participação de atividades acadêmicas, organização de eventos, publicações científicas, participações em bancas, atividade de orientação, e participação em atividades editoriais. E até depois, recebendo o livro aqui, eu vi, por exemplo, participação, pareceristas, né? Pareceres, que eu escrevi tão pouco. Hoje eu revejo isso aqui e disse assim, não, mas eu não só fui parecerista disso só. Eu dei tantos pareceres, acho que mais de 40 pareceres, né? Mas eu me prendi, quando eu escrevi aqui, a pareceres de revistas, né? Eu não me lembrei que eu fui parecerista de, como eu era da administração, fui vice-diretora do Instituto de Letras, e nas reuniões de colegiados, sempre a diretora disse assim, Noélia, dê um parecer aqui. Sempre sobrava para mim os pareceres. E eu, como sou daquelas mulheres que só sabem dizer sim, eu sempre acolhia, né? Então, foi sempre essa atitude de prazer, de alegria. Então, tem muitas histórias para contar, além do texto que hoje se encontra nas minhas mãos, além desse livro, que vocês também receberão. Será o meu presente para vocês, para depois também a gente se encontrar e conversar mais. Não vou tomar mais o tempo de vocês, só era esse encontro, não é? Por isso que essa roda de conversa, e cada um deve ter uma historinha para contar a respeito da minha vida, desse nosso trânsito, eu na vida de vocês, vocês na minha vida, não é? E como a vida é isso, né, gente? Esse momento que a gente só tem que agradecer por essas coisas boas, por esses momentos felizes, diante de tudo que a gente está vivendo nesse momento, né? A gente tem que agradecer por termos amigos, por termos pessoas que nos dizem a verdade, porque isso é muito bom, né? Às vezes a gente fica triste, fica aborrecido por as pessoas não chamarem atenção, né, Gi? Que a vaidade, o ego da gente não permite, né, que sejamos, né, desafiados, né? Então, vou começar. Eu sei que é ladies first, mas eu vou dar ao meu querido, e sempre que eu chamava Dad Advisor, com a chance de falar por primeiro. Espero que vocês duas não fiquem tristes, mas eu quero dar para José Roberto, que é uma pessoa que eu amo de paixão, ele sabe da nossa amizade, que eu sou muito, sabe, devota. Já tive outra história, Zé, que eu não contei. Foi a sua apresentação lá na Inglaterra, você lá em Warwick, né? Eu estava em Londres fazendo pós-doutorado, eu digo, não vou deixar meu ex-orientador começar o curso de Shakespeare sozinho lá, e eu, orientando, amiga dele, sem estar presente. Aí tomei o trem e fui para lá estar presente para vê-lo e para ficar encantada com os posicionamentos, com as pessoas, sabe, assim, meu Deus, que poço de sabedoria esse brasileiro nos traz. Então, eu me envaideço muito de ter essa amizade, de ter José Roberto Altscher na minha vida. The floor is yours.
Noélia, muito obrigado pelas suas palavras, pela sua bondade. De fato, você participou daquela aula inaugural da disciplina que eu dei no mestrado em Warwick. Foi uma gratíssima surpresa quando você me avisou que ia se deslocar desde Londres ao Warwick para assistir aquela aula. Foi uma satisfação. Muito obrigado mais uma vez. Quero te parabenizar pelo lançamento do livro, e a capa ficou muito bonita. Estou ansioso por receber meu exemplar. E a parte da sua narrativa, das memórias acadêmicas ali, que diz respeito a mim, mas de perto, é, de fato, o seu mestrado aqui na Federal de Santa Catarina, e esse episódio aí que você relatou. E eu herdei a orientação e nós fomos juntos até o fim. E eu acho que a Lara, no final da apresentação dela, quando ela falou sobre a sua energia, É sobre isso que eu quero falar também. A sua grande energia, é uma energia sempre positiva. Você é um dínamo de energia, de produção de energia. E a sua passagem aqui pela Federal de Santa Catarina deixou um rastro. Eu me lembro que duas facetas da sua defesa. A sua defesa foi numa segunda-feira, à tarde, no inverno, e chovia e fazia frio. E na sexta-feira você entrou em contato comigo, estava tudo pronto a apresentação, nós já tínhamos visto a apresentação juntos, e você me perguntou se poderia oferecer um coquetel na segunda-feira à noite em seguida da defesa. E eu, muito opressor, não autorizei. Eu disse, olha, eu não vou autorizar porque eu quero que você mantenha o foco na defesa, na preparação da defesa, porque eu sei muito bem a anfitriã que você é. E eu imaginei que se você fosse, a partir daquela sexta-feira, se preocupasse, incomodar, cuidar de um coquetel, eu receava que você pudesse perder um pouco o foco da defesa em si. Então eu não autorizei, muito, como um opressor, e você como uma orientanda sempre muito dócil e obediente, aceitou a minha negativa e não organizou o coquetel. No entanto, no final da defesa, nós anunciamos que um grupo ia para um restaurante em Florianópolis, ali na beira-mar, e que era por adesão. Quem gostasse de se reunir conosco para comemorar a sua defesa. Claro que nós da banca fomos, se não me engano era Marlene Soares dos Santos e Bernadette Puzzle.
Isso.
E era uma segunda-feira à noite, e para nossa grata surpresa, debaixo de chuva, umas 30 pessoas compareceram, por adesão, para participar do jantar, para dar um abraço a você, e aquilo realmente traduziu a amizade que as pessoas tinham por você e a consideração. Então foi muito melhor do que um coquetel, porque foi totalmente espontâneo, e nós ali comemoramos a sua defesa. E, de fato, o que eu mais me lembro de você sob o ponto de vista acadêmico é a sua energia, a sua perseverança, você é incansável, sempre aceitando as orientações, as críticas, as correções, e trabalhando com muito afinco. E foi uma experiência intensa, a gente sabe disso, mas foi muito gratificante para mim também. E quando eu li ali o relato sucinto dessa experiência na sua monografia de titularidade, consta do livro também, foi bastante emocionante voltar lá naquele momento do seu mestrado e relembrar aquela passagem tão bonita. Então, a minha mensagem aqui é de admiração pela sua perseverança, pela sua energia, como disse a sua aluna, e por toda a garra que você tem, a animação que você tem de promover não só o seu próprio trabalho, mas o trabalho dos seus orientandos, dos seus colegas, que são colegas hoje, serão colegas amanhã. É muito importante para eles, nós sabemos, para os alunos, esse tipo de situação, de dinâmica em que eles têm que apresentar, fazer apresentação formal sobre os seus trabalhos em andamento ou concluídos. Então, meus parabéns a você, como pesquisador e docente da Federal da Bahia, e foi um grande prazer trabalhar com você e continuar seguindo a sua trajetória. Depois eu fui, não me lembro, eu fui da sua banca de doutorado, se não me engano, na USP, muitos anos depois, e depois fui da banca de titular. Então foi um prazer acompanhar de perto a sua trajetória acadêmica. Parabéns, Noélia.
Obrigada, Zé. Por isso você não poderia deixar de estar aqui hoje, né? Você é parte da minha vida. Um beijo. Vamos agora a Silvia. Vou deixar a Gisele por último, Gi. Silvinha.
Então, querida, minha grande amiga, minha parceira de trabalho, que eu também, por muitos anos, a gente tem trabalhado junto, tem convivido junto, e por quem eu tenho muita admiração. Também por essa alegria, essa capacidade de criar vínculos, de fazer, deixar sempre os rastros, né? Aqueles rastros positivos, de carinho, de amizade, de cuidado com o outro, né? E de exemplo mesmo de profissional. Uma profissional que eu vejo que se vira para todos os lados e que tudo dá certo. Administra, trabalhou com a parte de administração, de coordenação, de pesquisa, em sala de aula, enfim. Porque eu, por exemplo, eu fico muito na pesquisa, sou muito de aula, de pesquisa, mas eu admiro quem tem essa capacidade assim, de liderança, de administração, e que se sai bem em todas elas, né? Então, eu quero também agradecer muito por você ter me puxado para a literatura irlandesa, né? Que eu comecei com ela, com James Joyce, no mestrado, ainda muito jovem, com 20 e poucos anos, e não sabia nem onde eu estava me metendo, e o susto foi tão grande que eu nunca mais voltei. Então, você me trouxe de volta o meu grupo de pesquisa. Então, hoje em dia, a gente está pesquisando livros de literatura irlandesa com a sua supervisão, com o seu conselho, aconselhamento, orientação. Leia isso, traduza aquilo. Por outro lado, você está chegando para perto da gente para mexer com audiolivros, né? Então, isso está sendo uma troca muito bacana. E foi ótimo também ter participado da sua defesa de titular. O seu memorial foi, assim, encantador de ler, brilhante, e eu gostaria de ler uma parte que eu achei interessante, que foi que mostra muito a narradora protagonista, que ela buscou uma epígrafe de Kundera. Eu adorei essa epígrafe, e achei que tem tudo a ver. Ela escreve: enquanto o futuro possa parecer vazio e desinteressante, o passado é pleno de vida, sempre pronto para nos irritar, veja a provocação, provocar e insultar, para que tentemos destruí-lo ou pintá-lo de novo. Então, assim é a autora desse memorial, que hoje está saindo em livro e que está chegando assim para muita gente ler toda essa experiência, né? Então, ela está sempre pronta para reescrever a sua história. E ao reescrever, passar a limpo para a própria vida, fazer um balanço de tudo isso, de todas essas experiências, e passar também para os outros, porque muitas vezes a gente vivencia e as coisas não ficam muito, meio que se vão no tempo, mas quando você guarda, você faz um memorial assim, dessa magnitude e publica, você consegue segurar mais, né, na memória, deixar os seus rastros para os seus filhos, para os seus orientandos, para os seus amigos. Então, fica assim uma lição de vida de alguém que é uma guerreira, na verdade, que está sempre pronta a recomeçar, a buscar novos caminhos e ajudar o outro. Essa generosidade sua também é uma coisa que encanta as pessoas, né? Então, continue sempre sendo assim, essa boa colega, essa boa amiga, essa competente profissional. E obrigada por estar aqui com vocês hoje. Gosto muito de Zé também, admiro muito. Gisele, eu não conheço muito, mas que bom estar aqui com você também. Obrigada, Noli.
Beijo, Sil. Muito obrigada pelas suas palavras. A gente também está, né, de mãos dadas para continuar essa luta, né, e entusiasmar os nossos orientandos com o nosso próprio entusiasmo, né? Levar essa energia para eles, para que eles também sigam os planos de vida, né? Os projetos de vida. E agora, minha amiga Gi, eu deixei por último, porque Gi, eu vou falar um pouquinho. Gi, eu conheci quando eu fui fazer doutorado em São Paulo. Me lembro que eu estava recém-chegada de Florianópolis, primeiro dia de aula, a aula do professor Limário e da professora Laura, que era Teoria da Narrativa. E a Gisele estava atrás de mim, né? Aí, primeira aula, segunda aula, e eu não conseguia escrever em português os papers, os trabalhos, até pedi a Limário para escrever em inglês, porque eu vinha de Florianópolis, né, Zé? Foi um curso que a gente estava totalmente mergulhado na língua inglesa, escrevia 4 papers semanais de cada disciplina. Então, realmente, não é babulice, né, vaidade, mas ficou difícil escrever em português. Eu não estava mais, o fluxo do pensamento, não sei, era algum bloqueio. Tanto assim que eu tive que começar a ler Estadão, ler revista, ler várias coisas para poder saber escrever, organizar parágrafo, etc. Enfim. E aí tá a Gia atrás de mim, assim, olhando, mas você vai escrever em inglês? Você escreveu em inglês? Você se lembra disso, Gia? Que eu tinha escrito em inglês. Parecia que eu era assim, uma pessoa super, que eu queria me mostrar, como a gente diz aqui na Bahia, né? Mas não era dificuldade. Foi esse momento, eu me lembro muito do estranhamento que causei, né, com o meu trabalho sendo apresentado em inglês, quando lá deveria ter apresentado em português. Mas vai lá, Gigi, o que é que ficou na memória da sua amiga aqui?
Obrigada, Noela. Obrigada por me incluir nesse momento tão relevante da sua trajetória, da sua vida. É uma alegria, um prazer, uma honra estar aqui compartilhando esse momento com os professores Silvia e professor José Roberto. Muito obrigada. Não, olha, você citou um momento que eu tenho mesmo em mente na minha memória afetiva, né? Eu vim aqui mais como amiga, porque você é a minha veterana, né? Então, eu era lá aluna de pós do mestrado, você já era aluna de doutorado, então era um grande prazer ter essa troca, não só naquele momento inicial em que eu aprendi que em Florianópolis eles escreviam as teses e dissertações em inglês e na USP, não, e a Noélia, mas como assim na USP, não? E aí, dali, desse coleguismo, começou uma amizade, para mim, muito frutífera, no sentido mais rico da existência humana. Aquilo que eu não tinha tido em anos de faculdade, de bacharelado, licenciatura, ali no mestrado começava uma amizade que antes eu não tinha tido naquele ambiente de educação formal. Então, a Noélia habita na minha memória afetiva como aquilo que é tão importante para tantos educadores falar sobre pensar e repensar, que são os afetos. Nós aprendemos a partir dos afetos. E o que eu aprendi com você, Noélia, eu ainda lembro e ainda penso nisso todos os dias, ou dia sim, dia não. Você é, para mim, uma presença muito marcante por ser uma grande entusiasta, não só dos estudos, mas da vida, né? Você mostrou que levar os estudos com leveza, né? Levar os estudos não só com amor, dedicação, mas, sobretudo, com leveza e com um diálogo com a vida fora dos estudos importa, né? Então, acho que esse aprendizado eu levo comigo para sempre. E depois, as convivências que tivemos nos eventos acadêmicos, e não só, sempre me disseram isso que os professores Silvia e José Roberto falaram a seu respeito, da sua energia, da sua vontade, do seu entusiasmo de fazer, levar o conhecimento, como você tem vindo a fazer pela UFBA, e ano passado fiquei bastante surpreendida pelo fato de você, logo, né, tendo aquele momento de pandemia inicial, você já tocando evento online, meu Deus, Noélia já está com evento online, nós ainda estamos nos adaptando a esse momento. E cá está você de novo hoje com o lançamento. Olha, só vi algo diferente em lançamento, assim como esse seu no Japão, lançamento sem livro à venda, né? Só a vontade do livro, né? Mas o livro aqui, espero que recebamos e que seus alunos também tenham essa possibilidade de ler esse livro, né? Porque você foi e é incentivadora de passos de muitos jovens e os rumos deles também. E aí eu fiquei pensando que verso melhor poderia caracterizar a Noélia, né? Não tem jeito, Noélia. Você é uma mulher, é uma esteta, né? Você sempre me disse isso. E aí a beleza sempre é uma preocupação para você. Mas eu penso no verso do John Keats, a thing of beauty is a joy forever, não só pela sua beleza, sempre essa parte estética, mas a sua beleza na condução das amizades. Né? O professor José Roberto citou aí o jantar das 30 pessoas que na hora, por adesão, foram, e é isso mesmo, onde quer que nós estejamos, você é capaz de aglomerar positivamente, aglomerar pessoas amigas, você tem amigos em todas as esferas da sociedade, você é um exemplo, né? Acho que seus alunos sabem disso, de uma pessoa que não faz distinções, de uma pessoa bastante democrática, uma pessoa que acolhe tudo e todos, né? Então, muito obrigada, parabéns, e já espiei o livro, fiquei muito feliz pelas fotos, achei que é um livro bastante sucinto, claro que você fez muito, muito mais do que está ali, Mas em tempos pós-modernos, acho que um livro sucinto é bem-vindo, né? Meu editor já me disse que livros de mais de 200 páginas as pessoas não leem, então acho que você está na crista da onda. Parabéns aí.
Adorei a crista da onda, né? Obrigada, Gisele. Eu também agradeço e lembro da minha defesa, já Zé falou da defesa, me lembro que sua mãe e você e seu pai foram muito generosos, me oferecendo. José Roberto estava oferecendo aquele almoço, a paella, né? Na sua casa, né? São tantas histórias, se eu fosse contar cada uma, né? Mas eu acho que ainda vou contar as histórias e as aventuras pelas cidades, como uma viajante, uma globetrotter, né? Porque esses congressos, por exemplo, em Dublin, quando nós fomos para um IACL, que eu te encontrei, né? Pelas ruas da cidade, você comprando um monte de chocolate, a gente comendo chocolate. Tem muita história, Gi, para a gente contar.
Aliás, a Thalita, a minha mãe, mandou um abraço para você, dizendo que te admira muito. Ela não pôde estar aqui nesse momento, mas ela falou, fala para nós que eu admiro muito.
André, vem agora tocar um pouquinho. André Santana, ele trabalhou com a Emanuele na banda Eva, é um músico, compositor, ele é arranjador, faz milhões de coisas. Então, ele também generosamente veio dar a contribuição, tocando algumas músicas para vocês, para meu público que está aí me ouvindo, né, para os meus alunos. Silvia já conhece a André, que já foi para o aniversário dela.
Verdade. E toca muito bem, além de ser uma pessoa muito agradável.
Olha, tá vendo?
Eu estou soltando o ritmo nordestino aqui e vou mostrar aqui como casa perfeito a música. Talvez tenha até...
Tire um pouquinho, Dé, para você ficar distante.
Parece música nordestina mesmo, né?
Parece música nordestina, mas você está vendo, né, Zé? O irlandês não é presente. O multiculturalismo aí, né? Estamos atravessando fronteiras.
Será que não tem influência? Será que a música nordestina, a rabeca nordestina não vem daí? Né?
Thank you. Oh, obrigada. Obrigada a todos. Então, com a música, essa adaptação que André Santana fez para a música irlandesa, com ritmo... É baião, com baião. Eu achei que ficou fantástico, e principalmente porque entrou em sintonia com a questão, com o tema do evento, que foi o tema da migração, né? Então, agradeço a cada um de vocês, a Silvia, a Gisele, a José Roberto, e agora eu vou de pôr no correio os livros de vocês, e muito, muito obrigada mais uma vez a todos que estão aqui me ouvindo, minha norinha, que eu vi que está aí presente, meu filho, e os alunos, os pesquisadores, Kátia também está aí presente, Ah, Beatriz também! Oi, Bea! Obrigada! Catinha também! Tá vendo que os amigos não me deixam? Oh, que maravilha!
É verdade.
Oh, muito feliz, muito feliz. Não,
Parabéns, Noelle.
Obrigada, Zé, obrigada. Um beijinho para cada um de vocês. E assim, uma nova história se abre para ser contada, né? Eu tenho agora que
partir para... Muito bom estar com vocês. E uma honra estar aqui junto.
Obrigada
Tudo de bom
também.
para vocês.
Obrigada, Gi, também.
Obrigada.
Obrigada, Lara, que nos aguentou com a sua orientação técnica, porque eu também, igual a José Roberto, e muita gente aí não tenho nenhuma afinidade com esse mundo de tecnologia. Se não fosse a Lara, eu não ia. Sânio ontem também deu contribuição, a Rose também me ajudou bastante, Fernando e os demais. Então, muito obrigada.
Afinal, chegamos todos. Afinal, chegamos todos.
É verdade.
E que Deus nos abençoe, tome conta de cada um de vocês.
Muito obrigado.
Né? Proteja cada um livre de todo mal.
Isso aí.
Né?
Tudo de bom, queridas. Queridas, prazer em revê-las. Bom final de dia para todo mundo, viu?
Beijo para a Flávia, para a Marta.
Obrigado, muito obrigado. Muito obrigado.
Obrigada, Noli.
Tudo de bom.
Tudo de bom também, Silvinha.
Tchau. Obrigada.
Lara?